requirement of 80 pits per year by 2030. The United States previously produced plutonium pits for our nuclear weapons at the Rocky Flats plant in Colorado. That plant has now closed, and the last produced plutonium pit was in 1989, 30 years ago. Nuclear weapons are like any other weapon system in the sense that they require maintenance and they require components to be periodically replaced. That means we need spare parts. A plutonium pit is a component of every nuclear weapon that we have, which enhances explosive capabilities, and we simply do not have the needed components to maintain these weapons. It is understood that properly maintaining our nuclear weapons stockpile should be amongst our highest priorities. Therefore, I am urging support of this amendment, which strikes Section 3114. Section 3114 repeals the requirement contained in Title 50 U.S. Code 253(8)A that the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Energy will demonstrate the capability to produce 80 plutonium pits by the year 2027. This is a substantiated requirement. This is a requirement that has been validated by the Nuclear Weapons Council. Section 3114 also contains a sense of Congress that the National Nuclear Security Administration should prioritize producing 30 plutonium pits per year at Los Alamos National Laboratory and not divert resources to construct a second site for pit production. This section of the bill should be struck for several reasons. First, Los Alamos is a research facility, not a production facility. The Department of Energy and NNSA have other installations better suited for pit production. However, I'm not suggesting that Los Alamos relinquish their portion of the mission. Rather, I am suggesting we need a second production site to help achieve the 80 pit per year production requirement. The two sites should work together toward revitalizing plutonium pits. Second, Los Alamos has been attempting to produce a qualified plutonium pit since 2010. They have not yet produced any plutonium pits that could be qualified for use in a weapon. They've been trying for 9 years, sadly unsuccessfully. In 2021 is the deadline for producing qualified plutonium pits, and whether we will achieve that goal is in doubt. This provision solely focuses on a single site that has yet to produce any usable pits. Third, the facility at Los Alamos, where they are attempting to produce plutonium pits, has been plagued with safety problems. Safety problems so significant that the facility was previously shut down for 3 years. I understand those safety issues have been resolved, but there are other DOE installations with far better safety records. Fourth, there is concern a second site represents a $14 billion life cycle cost increase. However, that estimate does not include the offset by reducing the overall nuclear complex life cycle cost. According to the Institute for Defense Analysis report on pit production, the life cycle cost analysis omitted a significant number of personnel required for support activities for all Los Alamos cost options, closing much of the cost gap between the two-site versus one-site solution, making the cost virtually comparable. Further, focusing solely on cost would limit production to a single facility at a single site. This would jeopardize our nuclear deterrence and a new era defined by the national security strategy as a great power competition. The best choice for a second site is Savannah River site, which already has a facility certified to handle plutonium. There are engineering changes that need to be made. I don't want to suggest those are not without cost, but I'm convinced it's less expensive than constructing or certifying a new site. We need a second plutonium pit facility, and this is by far the best option. It's estimated that Los Alamos can achieve a maximum production rate of 30 plutonium pits per year, and I hope they achieve it. However, that is not close to the 80 pits per year required, which is currently the law that has been validated by the Nuclear Weapons Council to maintain a resilient infrastructure. In conclusion, I urge unanimous consent to submit for the record a letter from the STRATCOM commander, General John Hyten, dated 10.
Without objection, so ordered.
To the record concerning delay in pit production and supports the two-site plan. I ask support for this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper.
Thank the chair, and I would like to praise the gentleman from South Carolina. I know of no more patriotic American than him, or anyone who does a better job of representing his state and his district than Mr. Wilson. I'm a little worried, though, that he does too good a job of representing his state and his district. As members of this committee know, he and I have gone back and forth for years on the so-called MOX facility, which was finally subjected to a mercy killing. I called it for a long time the zombie earmark, the earmark that simply wouldn't die. But now finally it's gone. And now at Savannah River, we have to find a new purpose, new job creator there. And I'm not against jobs in South Carolina. I'm just worried, though, when he mentioned in his very fair presentation earlier that the estimate, the best estimate we have of the combined life cycle cost of being $14 billion more. If we also have a site in South Carolina, that's a lot of money. A lot of folks here are scrambling for tens of millions of dollars, and this is $14 billion we would be handing to South Carolina on top of all the other money we gave them in the MOX era. So having killed one earmark, I'm worried we're about to embark on another. Now, this debate is not about the 80 pit requirement. That's a very valid debate as to whether we will need that many pits produced every year. This is a debate about where we should do the first 30. And I think most people would acknowledge that all of the plutonium scientists in America are located in or around Los Alamos, or at least in New Mexico. There are very few, if any, in South Carolina. And to have this extra site at an extra cost of $14 billion seems to me to be an extravagance we simply can't afford at this time. So the debate is not whether we have 30 pits or 80. Many people want to get to 80. But first, we have to get to 30, and we have to get to 30 in a reliable way. The best estimate we have right now, if we focus just on Los Alamos and we work really hard, we might get there by, say, 2025. And that would be awesome. That's a necessary achievement because we do need to rehabilitate our nuclear weapons. This is vitally important, and I'm for putting it in where it is already in New Mexico. And let's help those folks do the best possible job in the quickest possible fashion so we have an adequate number of pits produced there, whether that number is 30 or 80. Los Alamos is the place, New Mexico is the state, and let's do it there rather than ship this plutonium all over America. I think New Mexico has a history of success in this area. We hope they can live up to their past achievements. The lab director there, Tom Mason, is outstanding. He used to be at Oak Ridge. So let's do it right. Let's do it at Los Alamos. And then if we have extra money, we'll consider South Carolina. I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Turner?
Okay, so I want to go for some analogies. But first off, let me deal with the earmark issue. Mr. Wilson did not write this into our code or into our nuclear requirements. Yes, this does affect South Carolina. I'm not from South Carolina, and I'm for this, and I would do this. And this isn't because of Joe Wilson. This is because I believe that we need nuclear weapons capability. Now, this is the analogy. Now, we keep talking about plutonium pits, but let's just call it what it is. It's a part of the bomb. And we can say that it's not classified. The nuclear pit is part of the bomb. Now, here's your analogy. I have a 1964 Cadillac. I love it. But you know what? I can't get in it and drive it to work every day. It is not reliable. It is not good for me to use that for commuting. I would have no ability to be assured that I can get where I need to with my 1964 Cadillac. We have weapons that are older. We have weapons that are that age, and they need replaced. You can't be a nuclear weapons state and say, I bought one, I put it in a garage, and it may be a 1964, but it's all going to be okay because I got one. You got to have something that works, that is reliable. The requirement that is placed before us is 80 plutonium pits by 2027. The DoD and all studies, DOE, have come back and said this is what we need and that we need 2 sites. This is what General Hyten said March 28th of 2019, and this is why your analogy is important. This is the general's quote, not mine, not someone on the committee just opining what's too expensive or not too expensive. General Hyten said, quote, I am concerned about building new weapons that will have 100-year-old plutonium pits. I think it is a risk the United States should not take. Here's your analogy. This is like me saying, okay, my 1964 Cadillac's too old, it's unreliable, so I'm going to build a brand new car, but I'm going to take the engine out. I'm going to put the 64 engine in my old car. Hey, guess what? You still have the same lack of reliability. We need to get to 80. We've been told DOD, DOE, all studies, we need this. We need 2 sites, both for reliability and to make certain that that we're able to reach the production level that we need. The $14 billion of difference that is cited it does not take into consideration all of the other factors that actually, in looking at Los Alamos, looking at the second site, make it somewhat comparable. But, you know, it shouldn't be my testimony. It should be Mr. Cooper's testimony. It shouldn't be like what's more affordable, what's not affordable. You know, I say that it breaks even. He says it costs $14 billion. This should just go to straight out testimony of what we have. And what we have in front of us is DOD and DOE saying that we need this. Now, if we combine all these things, if we say we're going to recall our nuclear weapons that are deployed, and we're going to hamper our ability to replace the nuclear weapons we have, we are starting down a path of not being able to meet the deterrence needs that we must have in order to keep our country safe. So I support Mr. Wilson's amendment, and I think that this is a requirement we have long pursued. You know, another aspect of this, I just want to add that every time we get in this situation and people complain about the cost of our nuclear weapons modernization continues to be affected by the fact that we run one way and then we wait a couple years, then we go run the other way, and then somebody else has a better idea of what we should be doing something else. Maybe we should just trust the people at DOD and DOE who are saying that what we need and put it in place and give them the dollars that they need to make certain we have a modernized nuclear weapons that are an actual deterrent to keep our country safe. I yield back.
Further debate, Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support this amendment. We have a requirement to modernize our nuclear force. And our DOD, our STRATCOM, the Nuclear Weapons Center, the National Nuclear Security Agency, they all say they need, and by 1927, 80 nuclear pits a year. And that's the minimum that they need. And we got to build a program to get to 80 by then. So according to the administrator, Lisa Gordon Haggerty, the requirement of 80 per year is at the low end of the requirement, given the pace and scope of the current modernization. And I know General Hyten personally. I live 7 miles away from him. I see him a lot. I trust him. He's going to be our vice chairman. And he was emphatic that we need to get to 80 a year. And there is no better voice on this than General Hyten, who's been running STRATCOM. And Mr. Turner only gave half that quote. Let me give you the full quote that General Hyten said. He goes, "I'm concerned about building new weapons that will have 100-year-old plutonium pits. I think that's just a risk that the United States should not take." And then he goes on to say, to continue what Mr. Turner, where he stopped, he goes, "The minimum requirement is by 2030, we need a plutonium pit production capacity up to 80 across the enterprise. We have a plan with DOE that we support that to get that to 80 at both Los Alamos and Savannah River in South Carolina." This is General Hyten. He is speaking with authority on this. If we want to have assuredness with our nuclear weapons, I think we need to follow what he's saying. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi.
You just spoke about Mr. Hyten. I do not recall him giving the Strategic Arms Committee a detailed study of why 80 pits a year were needed. What I do recall over the last 5 years, I've seen his letter, but the backup information upon which that number is based, I don't believe has ever been given to the committee.
But can I ask a question?
Of
The
course,
correct thing is to say, will the gentleman yield?
Will the gentleman yield? Thank you. I'm a sophomore, still learning.
of course, sir.
Are you doubting, though, that General Hyten feels that way?
I don't doubt that he wrote the letter, and I don't doubt that he'd rather have 150 a year rather than 80 a year. His task is to reduce the risk, and we share that obligation. We also share the obligation to the taxpayers that the money be spent wisely along the way. But once again, I do not believe we've ever received a study about why 80 pits. I do recall over the last 4 years that the number has grown from 10 to 20 to 30 to 60 to 80. And along the way, no analysis of why that growth has occurred. Now, it may very well be that there is out there a detailed study. It seems to me it ought to be shared with us so that we can make a rational decision about not only the total number that we're going to build every year, but also that we are able to determine where the best location that they be built. If, for example, the appropriate number is 30, then presumably Los Alamos would be there. The other thing that I'm concerned about is we have not seen a classified report on the degradation over time of Mr. Turner's engine. That is the degradation of the pit itself. Now, we probably might assume that one pit is not the same as the other. And since these things were used for a variety of weapons and stored and used in different locations, in different environments, that maybe the degradation changes from one to another. That is a critical factor in determining how many pits need to be built new to meet the requirement for the LEAP program, the Life Extension Program. So I think we can go a little slow here. I don't think we need to make the final jump to 80 and the accompanied billions upon billions of dollars that would be required. And so show me the studies. Show me the studies that the degradation in the plutonium is such that it is risky, that is, it may not implode properly. Show me the studies that we need to therefore have to go to 80 before we commit to the full, what will be $15 billion additional beyond what this amendment says our initial investment would be required. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Look, I want to engage in this debate simply because I have been in Mr. Turner's Cadillac, and it truly is a POS. But it is easier to get out of his Cadillac than out of his Mercedes. But what I would like to do, we sometimes
You're hurting him politically here, Mr. Bishop.
Superficial.
So,
superficially, let me yield 30 seconds to Mr. Turner simply so he can give the reference point, and then I want to take my time back.
I do not have a Mercedes. so,
if that's what you said.
So, Mr. Garamendi, my dear friend, it is the Nuclear Weapons Council, and in fact, in hopes that I would find something, I actually Googled the Nuclear Weapons Council, which they gave their report to us. Nuclear Weapons Council, I Googled Nuclear Weapons Council 80 pits, and I got the National Nuclear Security Administration's report dated April 17, 2019, which also has a link to the other report, and it discusses and validates the requirement for 80 pits, and I'll yield back.
Let me yield back, reclaim my time, because I too believe in what the military has told us of what this is essential. And we sometimes have a superficial way in which we look about these types of issues. And with that, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Wilson, because I missed his testimony when I came in late.
And thank you, Congressman Bishop. I appreciate that. And indeed, I want to thank Chairman Cooper for his kind comments. But indeed, this is not an earmark because what NSA has done is that they have done studies indicating that the MOX facility, substantially completed, is exactly where plutonium can be used safely and in the interest of our country. Additionally, there's a trained workforce. We have technical colleges and universities and colleges very close by the facility in Georgia and South Carolina to address the issue of the workforce. And it is also very warmly accepted by every level of government in the region. I would also like to point out that there's been substantiation of the need for the 80 pits. I've already introduced the letter by General Hyten. We've had testimony here on March 28th by General Hyten. But additionally, on April the 9th, we had the director of NNSA, Ms. Lisa Gordon Haggerty, confirm that STRATCOM and the Nuclear Weapons Council requirement is to produce not less than 80 pits per year and for our future nuclear weapons needs. Additionally, these numbers are based on production timelines, life extension milestones, and operational requirements. Additionally, she testified during her subcommittee appearance that she reaffirmed that her highest priority is the plutonium pit manufacturing, and the Nuclear Weapons Council has endorsed the NNSA's two-site approach to pit production at Los Alamos and Savannah River. And indeed, there have been studies by the Nuclear Weapons Council, which is a joint activity of the Department of Defense and Department of Energy. And additionally, last year, the NDAA required that there be a study, and it was done by the Institute of Defense Analyses, a not-for-profit corporation that does extraordinary research in terms of scientific, technical, and analytic expertise. And they too have come back that there needs to be a capability of 80 pits. And so the studies have been done, and I just urge people to look at this and understand it's just not, it's so important for the nuclear defense of our country. I yield back.
Mr. Horace Small.
I just want to reinforce the point that this question is not about the number of pits that are advisable. The question is about where they should be manufactured. And it's been said during debate that part of the reason why things can get expensive is because we're going back and forth on decisions. We already have a facility that's dedicated. And so we should stick with that and continue to do the work that we need to do.
Let me just say, I loved that argument right there. Very concise, to the point, and I believe it took 20 seconds. Just because you have 5 minutes ticking down off the clock in front of you doesn't mean that you have to fill all of that time by repeating what you've said. So thank you for setting that fine example. And with that, Mr. Mitchell, I will recognize you.
Mr. Chair, I believe I've adhered to the theory of brevity and never gotten close to my 5 minutes, so I won't do so here. If I believed Mr. Wilson was trying to get a secret earmark of $14 billion, I would take him up behind the building, wrestle him for the $14 billion for Michigan's thumb. I don't believe that's the case. I think we're overlooking some things. First, there's a safety factor involved here. The Department of Defense has talked about that without replacing these pits, we run into safety issues. And we talk a lot about that in this committee. Why is it we're not as concerned about getting those 80 and making sure we have options to we get full flexibility to achieve the 80? The other is, Mr. Cooper, all due respect, you talk about $14 billion being the additional cost. IDA themselves has indicated they fail to consider the engineering folks fail to consider the personnel requirements at Los Alamos to get to the 80. And when they considered them, in fact, the cost to be significantly diminished. That's their quote, not mine. So in fact, I don't have an exact number, I'll admit, but it's not 14 billion. So let's not kind of put out big numbers and cause issues here. They indicate it's significantly diminished from the $14 billion number they originally quoted. And so let's not, for the sake of having flexibility and getting to 80 pits, I think we should agree to the amendment. And I support it. Thank you. And that was only a minute 15.
Still not as good as Mr. Horace Small, just saying, but pretty good, pretty good. All right. I think that the concern here is whether or not we're going to be wasting money on trying to develop pits at the MOX facility. As Mr. Cooper has said, I have my quibbles about the 80 pit requirement. They got there awful fast after telling us that there were 10, 20, or 30, and it just kept going up. And I would love to see a better, clearer analysis as to why we got to those 80 pits. I know they said that, but that's not really the big point on the underlying mark. The big point is, are we going to wind up wasting an enormous amount of money at the facility in Savannah River, which, by the way, was largely created for an entirely different purpose? And let me also tell you, I wish we could roll the tape over the course of the last 10 years, the number of times we were assured that the MOX facility was exactly what the NNSA wanted, that it was going to work, that it was going to successfully process the nuclear stuff. They were going to get there. And then, okay, next year, well, we didn't quite get there this time, but you know, we're going to get there. And we never did. And I don't have, off the top of my head, the exact amount of money that we wasted at that facility. And I say wasted because they never produced what they said they were going to produce. But it is not a small number. So when the NNSA comes and says, hey, we got this, it's going to work at this plant, I don't sort of just fall over trusting them on that remark. So our concern is that they more adequately explain to us how they're going to be able to do this in a cost-effective way. Los Alamos has been doing this for a long time. We have that facility. There are also other options other than the MOX facility down in South Carolina. And I have seen the history, however they arrive at their decisions, and anyone in this committee who thinks there isn't a political aspect to Pentagon decisions or NNSA decisions, you need to pay a little closer attention, because there is a political aspect to it, and pressure gets brought. And I understand we want the South Carolina facility to work. That would be great. I don't want to waste taxpayer money on it. That's what we're concerned about. We want to see the justification for the fact this facility that they're picking to build it at is actually going to work, because they do not have a particularly good history of doing that. So that's the concern and the reason that I'm going to oppose this amendment. Anybody else? All right. All those in favor of the amendment by Mr. Wilson will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. No. Opinion of the chair? Yes, Mr. Wilson.
Ask a recorded.
Recorded vote is asked for. We will spend on this one. And we're going to back up. Well, okay. We're going to do both of Mr. Wilson's and then get to Dr. Descharles. So next up is going to be log 425. For what reason does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will pass out the amendment. Without objection, we will dispense with the reading of it, and the chairman is recognized, Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment promotes an increase in funding for national security challenge that has been previously discussed, and that is the plutonium pit production. The Senate NDAA has marked up to the president's budget request, which supports the 80 pits per year at a two-site solution. For the same reasons that I've mentioned in previous debate, I ask you to support this amendment, which adequately funds a two-site solution for plutonium pit production as recommended by the NNSA and the Nuclear Weapons Council. It is important for Los Alamos and Savannah River to join forces together in accomplishing this mission. To reiterate some points from the previous debate, modernization of our nuclear weapons stockpile should be amongst our highest priorities. Second, the 80 pits per year requirement by 2030 has been validated by the Nuclear Weapons Council and the Institute for Defense Analysis. And third, two sites will increase resiliency to unplanned production outages and can adapt to shifting requirements and counter future threats. The Savannah River site is ready to work with Los Alamos to achieve full nuclear modernization in a safe, low-risk, and timely manner. And I ask support for this amendment, and I yield back.
You want to take a shot at this? Mr. Cooper.
I'd like to speak in opposition to the amendment. I hate to be too graphic in my description, but I'm afraid this is the first tranche of the earmark right here. And where do they take the money from? Operations and maintenance. We've had a readiness crisis with our military for years because everybody's favorite piggy bank is operations and maintenance. Now, there are a lot of technical reasons for that, and this may seem like only $241 million, but that's about the amount of money that MOX was getting in South Carolina virtually every year for the last 5 or 10 years. And as the chairman noted, it never produced a thing. It was never completed, and they couldn't even agree on the degree of completion. That's why I called it years ago the zombie earmark. So here it is again in a different form. And the worst part of this amendment isn't so much trying to push the second site. The worst part of this amendment is raiding the operations and maintenance account because it's everybody's favorite piggy bank. Let's stop this raid right now.
Anybody else? Only thing I would add is my helpful staff pointed out to me, we actually spent $5 billion on the MOX facility to produce nothing. So it does happen that we make mistakes along those lines, and I have the same argument against this amendment that I had against the previous one. Anybody else any comment? All right. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. I keep doing that. When I get done talking and start over again, I turn it off, and I'm still talking. Dr. Desjardins, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Now I've forgotten what I'm supposed to say. Clerk, distribute the amendment, and without objection, reading the amendment will be dispensed with, and gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
My amendment would strike section 1649 of the MARC, requesting an independent study on a no first use nuclear weapons policy. We do not need a study on this issue. We know that this kind of policy would not only erode U.S. and NATO deterrence strategy, it would relay to our adversaries that our will in maintaining vigilance against attack on the U.S. and our allies is wavering. Russia hasn't had an NFU policy since 1993. China is strongly continuing to eliminate its policy as well. Both countries continue modernization efforts of their respective nuclear forces and are making great strides in new capabilities that this MARC does not adequately prioritize, such as hypersonics and directed energy weapons. This is not the time to be considering a no first use policy. It gives our adversaries permission to escalate, it puts our allies at risk, and it risks destabilizing the strategic environment. As recent as 2016, President Obama considered an NFU policy, and his own Secretary of Energy, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense argued forcefully against it, and the policy was never adopted. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and not entertain consideration of a policy that both NATO and the Department have continuously said would make the world less safe, not more. I yield back.
Thank you. In response to this is something we've worked on, talked about for a while. Again, the purpose of nuclear weapons, straightforward, is to deter their use. Now, there are a number of people in the anti-nuclear world who envision a world without nuclear weapons. I do not envision that world. You, in my opinion, cannot unring the bell. The ability to develop these weapons exists, so it is very important that countries like the United States of America have nuclear weapons in order to deter anybody else from using them. I think that is very important. But we don't want to be the ones who are starting the nuclear exchange. And certainly there are arguments where backed into a corner, you may want to use a nuclear weapon, but I don't think those arguments carry the day versus the catastrophic effect of starting a nuclear exchange, because we're not the only ones who have them. Now, I'm mindful of where the votes are at on this. We don't have a no first use policy in the bill, but I don't think it would hurt to at least have a broader discussion about it and think about it. And that's what this does, is it asks for that study and that discussion. I think that's reasonable, given the risk associated with starting a nuclear war. So I will oppose the amendment. Further discussion. Mr. Turner.
Dr. DeJarle asked me to join with him on this, and this is the only thing I want to say about a study that I think is important about his amendment. Mr. Chairman, you said that our nuclear weapons are designed to deter others so that they don't use nuclear weapons, so that the use of nuclear weapons would be unthinkable. I don't know how you study the effect of a no-use policy on your adversary unless you can get in your adversary's head. So we're going to get the same thing that we got when we had a hearing on this, which is just academics telling us what they believe that our adversaries, what Putin's going to do, what somebody else might do, who it might deter, who it might. The reality is we'll never know. But we do know one thing: a no-use first, a non-policy on no first use, indicating that we're unclear as to what we would do, leaves certainly the world as it is, and that is people have been deterred. They've been deterred for over 50 years. So this policy, I think, would be dangerous, and I think a study is not going to give us any information to make a decision on this. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman,
Further discussion? Mr. Garamendi?
maybe I can do this in 90 seconds. Is it good to be ignorant? Is it good to be ignorant? Is it good not to have someone study this, and academics and, a bunch of folks in ivory towers and others, think tanks, go through this and say, what does a first use policy mean? It means this, it means that. The kind of questions that have been bouncing around here for the last couple of hours. It seems to me we would have some information. The other thing that would be extremely important in this, and my good friend, Mr. Turner, said that we can't get into the head of Putin or Chinese or whomever, but we could begin to understand what a first use policy means, whether we're the first ones to use it or they're the first ones to use it. There's no harm in having this study. It might give us some very valuable information. It might even cause me to believe that Mr. Turner's correct on his previous arguments, although that's a bit of a stretch, but it's possible. So why not? Why not do a study? Why not have somebody inform us and we can carry on a good debate at a late hour 1 year from now?
Further discussion? All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Pending the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it, the amendment is defeated. We are now up to block, how do we get to 396R1, by the way? Why not just 396? But anyway, log 396R, I'm sorry, I skipped one. Whoa, sorry. The board moved on me as I was looking at it. We're at 414. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will distribute the amendment without objection. The amendment will be considered read, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes. You would think after the 500th time I did that I would remember that, but it slips. Ms. Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was pleased to hear the chairman say he doesn't want to waste taxpayer money, and I'm confident he will therefore want to support my amendment. My amendment would basically eliminate section 1650 in the bill, which requires yet another study on the ground-based strategic deterrent. The majority must be aware of the multitude of studies that have already been completed on this subject, including the Air Force's analysis of alternatives, studies that look at sustaining the ICBM force beyond the end of the Minuteman service life in 2030. Perhaps the majority hasn't read the conclusions in that exhaustive analysis, in which the Air Force weighed several alternatives, including options to accomplish a service life extension to Minuteman III, a complete replacement of both Minuteman III and silo infrastructure, and a hybrid which would mix the existing infrastructure with a new missile. The majority seems also to have overlooked the most recent 2018 National Defense Strategy, which highlights our increasingly aggressive adversaries, all of whom are seeking or expanding long-range missile capabilities. They are also apparently ignoring the last 4 nuclear posture reviews written under both Republican and Democratic administrations, all of which assert the foundational requirement for the triad and our absolute need to modernize our aging nuclear system. But the majority seems not to be familiar with these conclusions, and they've ignored the millions of dollars already spent analyzing alternatives because they're seeking yet another report. I would like to ask that the majority consider the stack of reports that we have here, all of which have been completed within the last 4 years, all of which have the same conclusion, which is that the most cost-effective approach is to procure the ground-based strategic deterrent. It, in fact, is far more expensive than trying to keep the aging Minuteman III on alert. This committee ought to debate these issues. We ought to debate whether or not we should move forward on a whole range of topics. But to simply add another report requirement of an issue that has been studied ad nauseum is simply, I would say, an illegitimate way to address the issue and clearly a waste of taxpayer money. It's absolutely clear we need a modern, safe, credible, effective nuclear triad. If you support that, you should support my amendment. I urge the committee to support this amendment, not impose yet another report requirement, waste yet more taxpayer dollars, but move to keep the GBSD program on schedule, on budget, and not adopt yet one more superfluous report requirement of something that has already been studied. So I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter all of these reports into the record and ask that the committee adopt my amendment and strike section 1650 from the markup. Thanks. I yield back the balance of the time.
Mr. Garamendi.
Well, let's see. The last one of these things that came up that we were seeking information, I did it in 90 seconds. Maybe I'll just repeat what I said before. Wasting taxpayer money on rebuilding the entire strategic defense system, that is the ground-based missiles, without understanding all of the implications involved. I will admit that we certainly have a command and control issue, and that certainly needs to be upgraded. But I'd also, if I read correctly about 3 weeks ago, that there's about a 2-year delay now in moving this system forward as a result of some questions that have been raised about some of the underlying issues, which we probably can't discuss at this point. But why do we have a problem with the study? Why do we have a problem that probably cost us, I don't know, maybe $1 million when we're looking at spending billions upon billions? There is one of the principal reasons that they want to replace these missiles is that we use a few of them every year to test whether they're actually going to work. And guess what? Year after year after year, they work. We don't need to use 3 of them to test every year, although we're now using them as decoys for the anti-ballistic missile system. So maybe that's a perfect use of them. But we really need information here. This is a very significant debate about what to do here, when to do it, what is necessary first, what is necessary later, what kind of refurbishment is needed in the various silos, all of those things. So why are we afraid of a study? I'm sorry, that took more than 90 seconds. It took 2 minutes.
Mr. Mitchell.
Did you say me?
Mr. Chair,
Sorry.
I have utmost respect for Mr. Garamendi, but if you'd like, I mean, it's not far for me to walk down there. I can give you the nuclear posture review from 2018. I can walk down. We have a really extensive nuclear review for the new age. National Institute for Public Policy, pretty bipartisan, pretty nonpartisan group. 2017. So we want to spend more money to tell us the same thing we already know here. I'll give them to you. I know you've seen them. You've been here a long time.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
Thank you so very much. I've read those studies. I've read them cover to cover. I've read the analysis. It's the backup. It's the detail behind it. The nuclear posture review was written by the new administration coming in, who was determined to increase the nuclear arsenal of the nation. The underlying studies are either not mentioned in there, do not justify the conclusions that are based. One of the conclusions in that nuclear posture review is that the United States is willing to use nuclear weapons in response to about 5 different categories of attack, including biological attacks, cyber attacks, nuclear attacks, and various kinds of war issues.
Well,
I would raise questions about that. Now, if I
Let me
might
claim my
just
time
finish.
back here in response. I mean, we're
The
trying to finish
underlying
this fine.
studies are not
Let me
in
claim,
that process that you just described.
as you well know, these studies can't contain the backup that you're seeking in a public forum. You receive, in a classified manner, a great deal of that information. I can't tell you exactly what you want for your mind, but you receive that. And somehow we're ignoring the classified briefs, and I yield the remainder of my time to Ms. Cheney.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the importance of the issues that our colleague, Mr. Garamendi, has raised, but particular study that we're talking about here is a study on the ground-based strategic deterrent and whether or not it's more cost-effective to move forward with that or yet do one more life extension of the Minuteman III. All of these studies, and they are government studies, they are non-governmental organizations, the whole range, nonpartisan, they all look at that same question and they all come to the same conclusion. And the conclusion is that it is far more cost-effective as well as far more important in terms of meeting our national security requirements to procure the GBSD and not do yet one more, attempt to do yet one more life extension to keep the aging Minuteman III on alert. So if we really are concerned about taxpayer dollars and we really are concerned about a situation where we cannot delay the continued deployment and the procurement of this important system, we ought to at least recognize this study's been done. Like, let's have the debate, let's have this argument over the issue if that's what we're trying to do, but the majority should not use studies to impose additional requirements at cost of additional taxpayer dollars to avoid saying they don't want to move forward with modernizing the nuclear triad. That's not legitimate, it's not fair. We ought to say the studies are here, we're going to enter them into the record and not force the department to go forward with yet
Without
one more
objection, so
study
ordered,
and
by
one
the way.
more waste of time. And I yield back to Mr. Mitchell the balance of time.
Thank you. And without objection, we'll enter the studies into the record. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you want short speeches? Cheney's right. The report requirement is redundant. We have the information. Heighton was here in March in this very room saying life extension of Minuteman 3 is not cost effective. We know the data already. I support her.
Further discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye. Opposed, no? Paying the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. All right. It's now in order to consider on block package number 2, and the chair recognizes Mr. Cooper for the purposes of offering the on block package.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up on block package number 2, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will distribute the amendments. Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to discuss them.
The en bloc package number 2 is comprised of the following: Amendment number 64 by Ms. Davis concerning DoD resource sharing to assist with natural disasters. Amendment 68R1 by Ms. Gabbard regarding a report on the Runit Dome in the Marshall Islands to identify environmental and health-related concerns related to the nuclear material located in the dome. Amendment number 76 by Mr. Cook concerning requirements for preparation to implement a plan for use of Allied launch vehicles. Amendment number 28 by Mr. Conaway concerning opportunities to leverage commercial low Earth orbit satellite technology capable of delivering direct satellite to broadband cellular technology. Amendment number 170R1 by Mr. Desjardins concerning an assessment of China's no first use of nuclear weapons policy. Amendment number 171R1 by Mr. Desjardins regarding an amendment to section 1645, which would limit the prohibition for a mobile variant of the ground-based strategic deterrent missile to 10 years. Amendment number 336R1 by Mr. Desjardins regarding an increase of $7 million for a lithium processing facility. Amendment number 391R1 by Mr. Lamborn, which amends DRL concerning directed report language concerning commercial satellites for remote sensing. Amendment number 417R1 by Ms. Cheney, which amends directed report language concerning unobligated enriched uranium and domestic uranium requirements. Amendment number 428 by Mr. Wilson regarding an increase in $6.5 million for the Savannah River community and regulatory support under Savannah River sites. That concludes my reading of the en bloc amendment.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further discussion on the en bloc package? Any comments? If not, the question is on the adoption of the en bloc package offered by Mr. Cooper. So many as in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. And we're now going to turn. Let's see, we're on Mr. Turner, log 003. For what purpose does the gentleman?
Madam Chair, I have an
Recognition.
amendment at the desk.
Please distribute the amendment for 003.
Ma'am, we can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Dispense with, sorry. Dispense with the reading, and we'll move to the gentleman who, please explain your amendment, right? Are we good?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is one that I think that we're going to get a fairly full agreement on. This committee required, the last National Defense Authorization Act required a test of the SM-3 against a SM-3 Block 2A against an ICBM class target. This provision would cancel that test. This provision has now been provided to the Missile Defense Agency. And if you do this, it will cost $121 million of unrecoverable sunk cost and set back the entire testing system for the SM Block 3 2 years. Now, why would you want to do a test like this against an ICBM? Because you want options to take an ICBM down. You want in mid-course options to be able to, besides our ground-based interceptors, to intercept an incoming threat and to take it out. So this test would verify that. It's already set up. It's already done. The only reason why you do this is if you're against missile defense. So there's no reason to cancel a test that's on its way in and that's going to cost $121 million to cancel, and that's going to set back the entire testing system of this missile for 2 years. And that's what the Missile Defense Agency has said. Staff can confirm this. We certainly shouldn't do harm in this bill. And this one does harm. There's no benefit to the U.S. There's no benefit to us. This is about advancing knowledge. This is a test. I mean, we're not deploying something. We're just testing it. We're understanding the knowledge of what it's capable of. So I would ask that my fellow members vote for this to save the $121 million, not lose 2 years in testing, and actually get the knowledge of how do we defend this country through missile defense. I yield back.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Mr. Carbajal. For what
Thank you,
purpose this gentleman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would like to speak in opposition to the amendment and in support of the chairman's mark. The provision in the mark would not prohibit a future test, but remove the arbitrary date set by Congress to conduct such intercept and require a DOT-NE assessment of operationally effective and suitable against the threats it was designed to intercept prior to conducting an ICBM test. SM-3 Block 2A experienced 2 in-flight failures during developmental operational testing and has only successfully engaged 1 intermediate range ballistic missile, IRBM, target for which the system was designed to be deployed on ships and ashore in Europe. EPA Phase 3. This amendment supports the fly before you buy principles to ensure that the taxpayers' dollars are being spent on the system that works. GAO has highlighted the lack of testing against medium to intermediate range threats for which the system was designed, and the potential of this lack of testing leading to future design issues well into production of interceptors. MDA's initial planning would have completed 5 IRBM intercepts up to this point. Due to several flight test failures and test range availability issues, only 1 has been successfully completed. Further, DOT-NE highlighted in their 2018 annual report that DOT-NE considers the FTM-29 SM-3 Block 2A failure to be an example of a shortfall in conducting ground testing in an operationally representative way, and an example of a deficiency found in operational testing that development testing should have discovered. SM-3 Block 2A production is currently on hold by the department due to issues discovered in the redesigned kill vehicle program, for which there is reuse of components between the 2 interceptors. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further debate? Stefanik.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to reiterate my support for Congressman Turner's amendment. First, I want to touch on the funding issue. The Missile Defense Agency has already expended over $121 million to execute this test. Those funds would not be recovered and would be a sunk cost. So for the taxpayers, this is $121 million. That's significant. Additionally, regarding the testing gaps, the next opportunity to test an SRBM or IRBM class target against an SM Block 2A is in fiscal year 2021. So this leaves a testing gap of 2 years. And I want to point out that the majority seems to always emphasize the need for operationally realistic test of missile defense assets. And this action artificially and purposefully introduces a testing gap of 2 years into MDA's testing master plan. Additionally, the Missile Defense Review identifies SM Block 2A as a potential underlay for our Homeland Defense missile defense system. This test would allow SM-3 Block 2A to add additional mid-course missile defense capability. So at a time when our only other mid-course system, GBI, is delayed because of a technical issue with the re-entry vehicle, we should be looking for every opportunity we can to increase our mid-course Homeland Defense capabilities, not denying those opportunities for protection. And just to respond to my colleague, Mr. Carvajal's comments, the Missile Defense Agency has told us that they will cancel the test if this language is included. So I urge my colleagues to support Mr. Turner's amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Any other comments? Any other debate? On this side, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Madam Chair, may I yield to Mr. Turner?
I just want to give our new members a translation, because you got to think, why would you want to get to cancel a test that's already scheduled? Why would you want to set back testing for 2 years? Why would you say that it's had a lack of testing and then cancel a test? It's because this is really an anti-missile defense provision. I mean, what we want, I think what the American public want, is the ability to have capability that takes down an ICBM. If this test works, there are people who are supporting this amendment that don't want that knowledge to ever be known, to ever understand that we might have the capability of doing this. We should test this. This has been planned, and this, by the way, is another one of those things that's never going to become law. The Senate's never going to allow this test to be canceled. There's no rational reason to cancel a test that is scheduled. It's going to cost $121 million of sunk costs and a 2-year delay. This has got only anti-missile defense undercurrents, and you should support this amendment. Thank you.
Okay, further comments? Seeing none. If not, the question is on the adoption of the amendment offered by Mr. Turner. So many as are in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. The noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. I don't hear very much.
Recorded vote, please.
Okay. A roll call vote is ordered. We will call a roll call vote at the end of our consideration of the subcommittee's mark. Okay, we'll now consider the next log number 390, R1, Mr. Lamborn. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk on the screen.
Please distribute the amendment, and without objection, we'll dispense with the reading of the amendment, and the chair recognizes the gentleman for the purpose of explaining his amendment.
This is actually a very simple amendment. It restores something that the current mark is prohibiting. And I want us to really think about this. The thing that America has over any potential adversaries is our creativity, our technological prowess and ability. Our asymmetrical advantage is our technological accomplishments as a nation. And I'm so disappointed that this amendment showed up. This provision showed up, section 1665, because it prohibits the Missile Defense Agency from even going down the path of exploring and researching and developing the possibility of a space-based missile intercept layer. We've had tremendous progress with directed energy, with neutron particle beams, with those kinds of technological advanced projects that to tell the Missile Defense Agency they can't even explore those to use against an adversary in the boost phase of that adversary lobbing a missile at us, I think is really ill-advised. I don't see why we would tell them to not even explore this possibility when if it's not going to work, it's not going to happen. If it would work, we want it to happen. We'd love to have a space-based defensive capability like this. So I would ask that we adopt this amendment and restore what we did 2 years ago. We put this language in 2 years ago, and in a spirit of being helpful to my colleagues, two of my Democratic colleagues voted for this 2 years ago, Mr. Garamendi and Mr. Norcross. So I would hope that they would be consistent and support it again this time. So I would ask for the support of this amendment and that we restore what 1665 had prohibited MDA from doing. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper.
I'd like to speak in opposition to the amendment. For especially new members of the committee, the technology we're really talking about here is called neutral particle beam. That was pretty thoroughly explored in the 1990s and largely abandoned. Right now, it happens to have one or two advocates in the Pentagon. And, you know, I hope, like the gentleman from Colorado does, that, you know, all technologies work, but some are more likely to work than others. I apologize because the amendment is awkwardly worded, talking about development of space-based ballistic missile intercept layer only. It's really about neutral particle beam. And this request for $34 million would essentially be a wild goose chase. Right now, it's a science and technology project at Los Alamos. It's not even a program of record. Folks I've talked to in the community, and I've asked virtually everybody about this in the hearings we've had this year, they kind of roll their eyes when they hear about neutral particle beam, because it seems to be the pet project of one or two people in the Pentagon, not a real thing that scientists think has a real opportunity to work. So I'm not against pet projects, and 1 in 1,000 might work, but it just seems like this is not as important a priority for the Missile Defense Agency as many other things. I shouldn't have to remind this committee that the redesigned kill vehicle, it should be their #1 priority. They are making us suffer an unwarranted 2-year delay because of an engineering series of mistakes that they made in designing that absolutely essential vehicle. And to siphon off $34 million so that somebody can play with toys in the Pentagon seems to me to be a little bit of a mistaken priority. So I would urge opposition to the amendment.
Further debate? Mr. Turner?
Okay, this is about knowledge. This is about research. This is about development. We all advocate for research and development and knowledge. Now, I just wrote down the words that Mr. Cooper was saying. Play with toys. Folks I talk to. This is about particle beams. All right, I'm going to read you what this says. None of the particle beam language is in there. It says, none of the funds authorized to be appropriated by the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020 or otherwise made available for fiscal year 2020 for the Missile Defense Agency may be obligated or expended to develop a space-based ballistic missile interceptor layer to the ballistic missile defense system with capability that is only able to be deployed in space. Now, none of us expect we're deploying anything in 2020. Nobody's expecting that we have anything that we're going to be sending up. This is all research and development. There's no words on particle beam. He says this is about A. The word A. It says A. That means any. You're doing none. And I can't imagine how anybody on this committee would say that for research and development, I don't want the United States to have any of this knowledge. By the way, you know, this is how we got in. You were all looking at the hypersonic issue and how we're being passed by Russia and China. And we were way ahead and we paused. It's the same thing. How is it that we could ever say, yeah, I don't want anybody working on that. I don't want to know that. So you should vote this down because it does not say what Mr. Cooper said it did.
Thank you. Any further comments? You know, one of the issues I think that we run up against in this is that when we looked at some of these in not exactly isolation, because we obviously are looking at a host of different issues, but part of the difficulty is really seeing what else is going on and where else can we actually put our efforts, put our focus. And I think our concern is that this is not doing that. You know, this is not putting it in the context that's so critical here. And so, you know, I know that there's still more concern about it. And further debate?
Madam Chair.
Okay. Mr. Thornberry. And Whit Burnett.
I realize since March 23rd, 1983, there has been a strain of thought in this country opposed to missile defense. I realize that there has been a consistent refrain that it will never work, that we shouldn't try it because it'll be provocative, that that it's a pet science project. I would hope that the success we've had, as well as the evolution of the threat, such as from North Korea, would have dispelled such lines of thought. And I'm sitting here listening to the last two amendments. One was we shouldn't even have a test of this missile. This one is we should not even explore whether space-based missile defense layer makes sense. I think that the American people expect us to promote, certainly allow, or promote the Defense Department to defend this country from missile threats. And to not test, to not explore, seems contrary to what they expect us to do in this very serious area where missiles are proliferating and the threats are growing. So I just, again, it does not make sense to me that we would want to dismiss out of hand a test or an exploration of a space-based missile defense layer, because I think the American people expect us to be able to defend the country, and doing so requires the sort of testing and research in these areas, among others, that can help us do that. I yield back.
Thank you. Any other comments over here? Okay, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I wanted to yield my time to Mr. Lamborn.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'll just make this brief. Mr. Cooper, I have all the respect for your abilities as a chairman, and you're a bright and intelligent guy. I would like you to consider with me that we as a country can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can pursue multiple lines of technological possibilities at the same time. Now, if it was true that canceling this out and taking that money and putting it in another program automatically translated into that other program being successful, then I would agree with you. But canceling this program doesn't mean that the other program you're concerned about, the reentry vehicle, is going to be successful. You know, that's a separate issue, and we shouldn't conflate the two. I think we as a country have the ability, and we have the responsibility and the opportunity to pursue different kinds of technological possibilities. And to not even say we can ever even go attempt that is wrong as a country. I would hope you would agree with that.
Would the gentleman yield?
Mr.
Would the
Whitman's
gentleman
time.
yield?
It's
Okay.
Mr. Whitman's time.
Madam Chairman, I yield my time
Gentleman
back.
has time. He can yield.
I have the highest regard for the gentleman from Colorado, and I particularly want to congratulate him because even though he's not a member of the subcommittee, he has better attendance than many of the members of the subcommittee. You care passionately about these issues, and I share your concern for science. In fact, I'd like to invite you to a Washington event we've had for years here, the Golden Goose Awards, in which we celebrate nationally and internationally the sometimes unexpected benefits of government-funded research.
I'm there.
It's amazing. Well, we've actually had difficulty getting some folks, may want to talk to Randy Hultgren and folks like that. We've had difficulty getting folks from your side of the aisle to help us with that, because it is amazing what research can produce. And I am as pro-science as anybody in Congress, maybe as anybody in America. I hope and pray this works. But from the witnesses I've talked to on subcommittee who give me these eye rolls, it just seems like of all the areas we could explore, this is not one of the more productive ones. And maybe they're all wrong, but we have to prioritize on this committee. And I just think the evidence so far, at least, is that this is more of a science fair project than it is something that's likely to help us with missile defense. I am for missile defense. I want to fund it in a way that it will work, you know, and let's work on that together. I think we can do that.
Thank you. There's further debate on the question. Mr. Bacon.
Thank you. It'll be real brief. We know the Russians and Chinese are working overtime to develop anti-ballistic missile capability. If a space layer defense is possible, I guarantee you they're going to go down that path and try to field it. We don't want this to become like hypersonic weapons where China gets a big advantage on us. We have to catch up. I think it's worthy of doing research to know what is the art of the possible. We do not want to be left behind here. Russia and China put so much more energy on this than we do. We can't afford to be left behind. So I think we owe more effort into this research area to see what's possible. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bacon. And I want to just take the prerogative and turn to the staff. I mean, is there any sense of cost factors that we're talking about in this regard?
Ma'am, the only thing in the budget for 20 right now is neutral particle beam that would fall under this provision, and it was $34 million that they requested. The test bed, I think, is around $200 million just for that component. There are no costs for the full-up system at this point.
So 200 million?
Approximately for the test bed, correct.
Not a small amount of change. Correct. This is not for the study, but you're talking about the
Test bed.
Correct, it would be for the test bed. Correct, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Any more discussion? Okay, then the question is on the adoption. Oh, Mr. Moulton?
I just want to clarify, are we talking about the cost of studying this, or are we talking about the cost of implementing it?
In 2020, there's $34 million to begin development of a test bed that would be deployed by 2023. So it is not a study at this point. It is development money for the actual test bed for a neutral particle beam.
Gentleman yield. This provision, though, is so broad that it bans everything, right?
Sure.
This is not a line item that's removed. This is everything. Anything that anybody considers, anything that anybody wants to do or redirect funds to or has in their budget, they are prohibited from doing anything in this category.
The clarification.
Just say correct, because you know it's correct.
The provision states it has to only be deployed with possibilities to be deployed in space.
Right,
Other
but it's an
development.
absolute prohibition. This is not a line item. It's not like you went into the budget and said this line item's limited. It is a absolute prohibition that no one can go into their lab and consider anything with respect to this prohibition.
If it can only be deployed.
Thank you for yielding your time. I yield back.
Can I follow up with your question, Mr. Turner, then? I mean, is that language that is typically used in this situation, that it would be fully prohibited?
The way the language is written, it is a prohibition for any development of a technology that can only be deployed in space. That does not apply to other technologies that could be deployed on things such as UAVs, aircraft, sea-based, or land-based.
Well, I mean, but it's complete. But it's not just a line item on a specific development project. It is complete.
Correct.
Okay, because I want to be sure everybody's understanding that. Am I hearing that from everyone at the table, that that's the understanding? Is that correct? Okay.
Madam
Yes,
Chairman?
ma'am, I concur with that.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not still exactly sure where that fits into what we already are working on in an aggressive way versus this program.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
As I understood this issue in its intention, it was what we often use around here, fly before you buy. That is, that the system is developed, that it's pretty clear that it will work, that its purpose will be achieved. My understanding of the way in which this was intended was that we would not move to the deployment until such time as we had assurances that there was a probability or a high probability that it would work. The current discussion here seems to indicate something different. And it seems to me that Mr. Turner would agree we ought not spend a whole lot of money on building a system that we're not sure would work, but we ought to move in stages. In other words, fly it before you buy it. That is to make sure that have a high assurance that it's going to work before we deploy.
Ma'am,
Yes, I'd be
if I
happy
could
to
have
yield.
some of your time. This isn't about that. This is a complete prohibition against anybody doing any research and development, anything with respect to any portion of missile defense that would be deployed in space.
I understand what you're saying.
That's what we're debating.
I understand what you're saying, reclaiming my time. I understand what you're saying. I also understood the description that the staff has given us, which was different than my understanding of what was intended by this amendment. Now, I think what we might do here, and if Mr. Turner, or excuse me, Mr.
Mr.
Lamborn,
Lamborn.
the author of the amendment, would consider this, is that to proceed with the engineering, the science, to the point that we have some reasonable assurance that the thing's going to work, and you can go through the testing process, but don't move to the deployment until we have some assurance that this thing's going to work. So perhaps what we need to do here is to redesign
Mr. Garamendi, just one thing.
foundation.
We claim-
It's just a 1 year period. You're for Mr. Lamborn's amendment because that's not, because that would have, everything that you're concerned about is like another year, another request. This is just this request and this ban. No one's deploying anything. And this only applies in this year, but it stops everything. So you're right. You're actually speaking in favor of his amendment, which I am too.
Thank you, Mr. Turner. And to be quite honest, I've also, Mr. Melton.
I
Right,
so
this is,
I believe
I actually
time
never
is
yielded
still
my
mine.
time, and this is actually why I brought
Reclaiming your
this
time
question
or
up,
giving up your time?
because I'm not
Walk
sure we
away
quite
from
understand
5
what's going
minutes
on
and
here.
everything
Might I
goes to hell.
retain
All right.
But I actually agree with both Mr. Garamendi and Mr. Turner, and would like to support the amendment because I don't think we should cancel all research and development on this technology.
So now that the chairman has.
Now I do yield back.
We're gonna,
Well,
we're gonna give it back to him, but,
Madam
but
Chair.
it sounds to me like there's enough question that maybe we don't want to move perhaps in the language that we have right here and come back to this in a little
If I
bit.
could, and sorry, Mr. Chairman, you've
I'm
not
sorry,
been here.
before we keep going here, we got like 5 people talking. Whose time is it? at the moment?
Mr. Chairman, it's
It's-
mine.
It's Mr. Garamendi's time. Mr. Garamendi, it is your time. Do you wish to speak or yield to somebody?
Well, I've yielded to several people unknowingly, but I would like to do this. I think that there's a need to hold this for a while.
Yeah.
To, I think, follow what was suggested, and that is, let's see if we can work out some
If
language
gentlemen-
here that achieves the goal without flying before we buy, or buying before we fly, that we continue the research, but not kill
Okay,
the
got it.
project.
Hold on just a second. It's Mr. Lamborn's amendment. So
Right, I want to make that clarification. Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman, if I might for just a second, just to help clarify
Well,
some things.
I
The
think-
language that we're all struggling with is the language that's in the bill, not the language that's in the amendment. The amendment strikes the language in the bill.
got it.
So if we hold the amendment, it doesn't help us with the language that's in the bill.
Right.
We need to proceed with Mr. Lamborn's amendment,
Well,
If,
at your discretion.
yeah, understood. The possibility here is that we are able to rework the underlying language in a way that is agreeable to everybody as opposed to strike it. Now, if that's not possible, that's cool. But I believe what Mr. Garamendi is saying is that could we rework this in a way that makes the underlying thing acceptable instead of striking it? But Mr. Lambert, it is your amendment. So if you want to do that, you may. If you don't, you don't have to. We can proceed on your amendment.
One, if the gentleman would yield, I would like to propose a possible solution, and that is to go with my amendment for now so the funding is in place. However, we discuss further before this hits the floor, whether or not we want to clarify that we're not talking about deployment of it. Nothing's going to be deployed. It's strictly research and development. In fact, nothing is ready for deployment. I mean, that's not even really an issue. It's, yeah, and that's what my amendment is seeking to accomplish right now, is we continue with the research and development.
if I might, Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Garamendi, you still have a little time here, mainly because they keep stopping the clock. for
well,
reasons I
the
don't fully
clock
understand,
stopped
but,
and I thought it was, anyway, let me just make this very, very quick. Let's do something that creates clarity here. We're very close to an
Yeah.
agreement here. The research, the development, that's not a problem. The deployment would be. By striking all of the language, we might wind up with deployment. Let's just write something that's very clear that says, continue with the research and the development, hold the deployment until such time as there's whatever words work.
Would that language be agreeable to you?
It would be agreeable to me. Would staff help me to do that before we finish out tonight?
Yeah, and you do not have to withdraw your amendment. You can just put it in abeyance, and if
Okay.
we can work out this language, then we can roll it into
In
an
the full
en bloc
committee
in the full
portion
committee.
of our hearing?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. We are now on. We just got rid of it. It's It's now in order to consider log 396R1. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wyoming seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. Hearing no objections, we'll dispense with the reading, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment seeks information from the department, helping to make sure that the committee is able to ensure that any extension of the New START treaty would reflect the reality of the threats that we face in the world today. In the decades since President Obama's New START treaty was ratified, the world has grown more dangerous. And my amendment doesn't say we should not extend New START. It's really an effort to make sure that this arms control treaty, like all should, contribute to the security of the nation by addressing the real threats we face. So the amendment seeks information from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, asks for the chairman to report to the committee on two things. First, Russia and China's expanding inventory of strategic and non-strategic weapon systems. And secondly, the impacts on our national security if an extension or a successor agreement to New START weren't trilateral, including China, the United States, and Russia, and also the impact on our security if such an extension did not include all strategic, non-strategic nuclear-capable weapon systems. Again, reflecting the reality of what we've seen the Russians do in terms of the expansion of their capabilities during the period of the New START treaty, and also what we've seen China do because they are not party to New START, not party to any limitations. So my amendment simply would ask for information to help the committee ensure that we're able to make an educated, informed assessment about whether or not any extension of the New START treaty actually served to contribute to the security of the nation. So I would urge my colleagues to adopt the amendment. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
All right. I need to understand what this amendment does precisely. If I'm reading this correctly, and there's a pretty good chance that I'm not, that this basically would require us to go back in and renegotiate New START, but we have to include the Chinese and the Russians.
And other billionaires.
Extraordinary. They'll say anything to get elected. And make sure to tune into my show. It's called Bulls and Bears. It's every weeknight at 5 p.m. Eastern Time right here on Fox Business. Of course, you knew that because you watch every day, 5 p.m. I'll see you there. A great panel. Kennedy begins right now.
And thank you, David Asman. Breadline Bernie wants you to be a socialist. And today he made his big pitch to the nation. The commies are happy as clams, but guess what? All he's pitching is a roadmap to economic ruin. So will anyone be gullible enough to take the bait? The Vermont senator and presidential hopeful has been pitching his red agenda for decades. Medicare for all, free public college, $15 an hour minimum wage, breaking up banks, and of course, the $90 trillion Green New Deal. If all of that sounds very expensive, comrade, it's because it is. Today at a hotly anticipated speech in D.C., Bernie made his case.
Every American, regardless of his or her income, is entitled to the right to a decent job that pays a living wage, the right to quality health care, the right to a complete education, the right to affordable housing, the right to a clean environment, and the right to a secure retirement. Democratic socialism means, to me, requiring and achieving political and economic freedom in every community. The only way we achieve these goals is through a political revolution.
Oh, Bernie, notice how he throws revolution in there? That's like a bat signal for every wannabe in a Che Guevara t-shirt, or every fake Marxist Bernie bro who carries around the Communist Manifesto just to pick up chicks. Yeah, that can puka. What Bernie doesn't tell you is how on earth he's going to pay for this fantasy, but here's a hint. He's going to have to jack up everyone's taxes so high, the only Green New Deal you'll get is the half-eaten salad you rummage out of the trash, you dumpster diver. But enough about my lunch today. Bernie also took some time to go after President Trump, claiming he too supports socialism. What?
While President Trump and his fellow oligarchs attack us for our support of democratic socialism, they don't really oppose all forms of socialism. They may hate democratic socialism because it benefits working people, but they absolutely love corporate socialism that enriches Trump and other billionaires.
Like Hillary Clinton. But old Byrne didn't stop there. He went after the CEO of one of the nation's top banks. Earlier today,
General Hayden, and I would just want to put this on the record. That two things. First, in the nuclear posture review, it says that New START's really important. Having heard the nuclear posture review bringing it up several times. And in February of this year, General Hayden said, New START's really important. That's a paraphrase of the lengthy statement he made in support of New START. So I just want to bring General Hayden and the nuclear posture review back to support my position this time. With that, I yield.
Thank you. By the way, General Hayden, and the exact quote from him is that the New START Treaty is unbelievably important to me. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Walz.
Mr. Chairman, in support of Ms. Cheney's amendment, the Chinese nuclear missile arsenal, or the Chinese missile arsenal, is now the largest in the world. And they have built that arsenal while the United States and Russia have limited themselves under START and limited ourselves under INF. So I certainly think it would be responsible and reasonable to have the Pentagon come back to us and have the chairman come back to us with how the Chinese fit into a New START type arrangement, and certainly support Ms. Cheney's amendment.
Mr. Bolton.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to register my support for studying this as well. I think we could benefit from understanding what the implications are going forward. And I think it's a reasonable responsibility for us to gather that information. Yield back.
Thank you. As they say, don't sell past the close, or take yes for an answer. Pick your favorite analogy. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed? Amendment is adopted. Mr. Garamendi, you are next, but you've already spoken on it. So now you just need to do the withdrawal part.
3 seconds to withdraw my amendment.
All right, but then I got to go through the whole rigmarole of recognizing you for the amendment. So we'll go ahead and do that. Next up is log number 165. For what purposes does Mr. Garamendi seek recognition?
My amendment, sir,
You
deals
have an
with-
amendment at the desk.
I have an amendment to the desk.
Okay, the clerk will distribute the amendment. Hearing no objection, we'll dispense with the reading. Mr. Garamendi.
My amendment deals with the issue just before the New START Treaty. It is a plea to continue the New START Treaty, providing various reasons for it. I want to work with Ms. Cheney on the study. That's her amendment, which apparently is going to be in the final mark. And I'm about to walk down with her, or take down to her, how she might improve her study. With that, I withdraw my amendment.
All right. Okay, sorry. Okay, we are now moving on to the recorded votes that came in the Strat Forces mark. And it would be helpful, and I know they put the numbers up there, but it would be helpful if the staff would just quickly read the official description of what the amendment does so members know what happens. So first of all, how many amendments do we have coming up for votes?
Four recorded votes.
All right. And so we've got, first up, Cheney 406, which does what exactly? This would be, well, tell me what it is so everyone knows. I'm not guessing.
Well, we don't have to worry about. So take a look at it. I think it
It,
fits nicely.
it strikes, it strikes the prohibition on deploying low yield.
It's the low yield nuclear. All right. And
I think there are more than that.
More than 4?
Right, because you've got the,
What one do you think we?
let me just check for just a second. We can just pause.
Give you the numbers, sir. Those are the four we understand where.
Those are the four that were asked for, I'm reasonably certain. There were a couple that weren't asked for that's.
It's the other one that we refer the others to full committee. It's okay.
Okay, all right.
Right.
All right, so we're going to start with 406. All right. We postponed proceedings on this. We're now going to proceed on it. So we have a vote on 406. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith.
No.
Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Bishop.
Aye.
Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner.
Aye.
Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Courtney. Mr. Conaway. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Mrs. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler votes aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Brooks. So, can the member, Mr. Brooks? Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook.
Aye.
Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown.
No.
Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves.
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna. Ms. Stefanik.
Aye.
Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating.
No.
Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins.
Yes.
Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham.
Aye.
Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim.
No.
Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly vote.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horn.
Yes.
Ms. Horn votes no. Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Aye. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell.
Aye.
Mr. Mitchell votes aye. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman.
Yes.
Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz.
Aye.
Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden? Mr. Golden votes no. Ms. Trahan? Ms. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Luria? Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Wilson? Aye. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin? No. Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Courtney? No. Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no.
Yes. How is Mr. Brown recorded?
Mr. Brown is recorded no.
You sure you want to take another stab at it? All right. It's either yes or no. We know that. Mr. Kelly, how is Mr. Kelly recorded?
Mr. Kelly is recorded aye.
That's good. Fourth time's the charm. So you're still going through the list of members who didn't respond the first time. You may continue.
Yes, sir. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Khanna? And Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego?
Mr. Carbajal? How is Mr. Carbajal recorded?
Mr. Carbajal is recorded no.
Okay, Mr. Gallego, I believe they were asking for your vote.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Escobar?
may I ask how I was recorded, please?
You may.
Ms. Escobar is recorded no.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, may I ask how I have been recorded?
Mr. Cisneros, how are you recorded?
Mr.
Mr.
Cisneros
Chairman?
is recorded no.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask how I was recorded?
I don't think I can.
Mr. Chairman, can we just take a recess as opposed to doing this? Because then we could all at least use the facilities. As opposed to-
I'm sorry, Mr. Banks just walked in. I think he wants to vote.
Mr. Banks votes aye.
And without objection, we will take a brief recess to try to give members a chance to get back. I think Mr. Turner's suggestion is correct, so we'll wait a couple of minutes. I believe we're only missing a couple of members. Try to give them a chance to get back here. That did come up, I think, a little bit more quickly than some people expected. We'll take a recess for a couple of minutes.
They just can't, they were gonna stall forever.
Okay, we're going to come back together here. So I said a couple minutes. It was a couple of minutes. And yeah, we are missing a couple members, but we do have to proceed. Now, Mr. Gallego, would you like to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to be recognized.
Mr. Gallego, how is Mr. Gallego recorded?
Mr. Gallego is not recorded.
Mr. Gallego?
I vote no.
All right. And we are, well, the clerk will report, I'm sorry, Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear.
Ms.
passed.
Spear? Ms. Spear, no.
Okay, the clerk will report the tally.
Anyway.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 26 and the noes are 30.
The amendment is defeated. It is now, we will, I don't know what the term of art is on this one, but we're going to vote on Amendment 397R1, which is somewhat similar to 406. This is about restoring the funding for the low-yield nuclear weapon. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith.
No.
Chairman Smith, no. Mr. Thornberry. Aye. Mr. Thornberry, aye. Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis, no. Mr. Wilson. Aye. Mr. Wilson, aye. Mr. Langevin. No. Mr. Langevin, no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Turner. Aye. Mr. Turner, aye. Mr. Cooper. No. Mr. Cooper, no. Mr. Rogers. Aye. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Courtney. No. Mr. Courtney, no. Mr. Conaway. Aye. Mr. Conaway, aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi. No. Mr. Garamendi, no. Mr. Lamborn. Aye. Mr. Lamborn, aye. Mrs. Spear. No. Ms. Spear, no. Mr. Whitman. Aye. Mr. Whitman, aye. Ms. Gabbard. No. Ms. Gabbard, no. Mrs. Hartzler. Aye. Mrs. Hartzler, aye. Mr. Norcross. No. Mr. Norcross, no. Mr. Scott. Aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Gallego.
No.
Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Brooks. Aye. Mr. Brooks, aye. Mr. Moulton. No. Mr. Moulton, no. Mr. Cook. Aye. Can the member repeat that? Aye. Thank you, sir. Mr. Cook, aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal. Thank you, sir. Mr. Byrne. Aye. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Graves. Aye. Mr. Graves, aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna. Ms. Stefanik. Aye. Ms. Stefanik, aye. Mr. Keating. No. Mr. Keating, no. Dr. Desjardins.
Yes.
Dr. Desjardins, aye. Mr. Vella.
No.
Mr. Vella, no. Dr. Abraham.
Aye.
Dr. Abraham, aye. Mr. Kim.
No.
Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Horn. No. Ms. Horn, no. Mr. Gallagher.
Aye.
Mr. Gallagher, aye. Mr. Cisneros.
No.
Mr. Cisneros, no. Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates, aye. Ms. Houlihan. No. Ms. Houlihan, no. Mr. Bacon.
Aye.
Mr. Bacon, aye. Mr. Crow.
No.
Mr. Crow, no. Mr. Banks.
Yes.
Mr. Banks, aye. Ms. Torrey Small. No. Ms. Torrey Small, no. Ms. Cheney. Aye. Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slotkin. No. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mr. Mitchell.
Aye.
Mr. Mitchell, aye. Ms. Cheryl? Ms. Cheryl, no. Mr. Bergman?
Aye.
Mr. Bergman, aye. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill, no. Mr. Waltz?
Aye.
Mr. Waltz, aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar, no. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland, no. Mr. Golden? Mr. Golden, no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan, no. Mrs. Loria? Mrs. Loria, no. Mr. Carbajal?
No.
Mr. Carbajal, no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Khanna?
Has every member voted? Any member wish to change their vote? Clerk will report the tally.
On this one, Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 26 and the noes are 30.
The amendment is defeated. We now move on to Mr. Wilson's amendment number 426, and this was about the plutonium pit production, if you remember that debate. The question now occurs in that amendment, and the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith? Chairman Smith, no. Mr. Thornberry?
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry, aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis, no. Mr. Wilson?
Aye.
Mr. Wilson, aye. Mr. Langevin?
No.
Mr. Langevin, no. Mr. Bishop?
Aye.
Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Larson?
No.
Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Turner?
Aye.
Mr. Turner, aye. Mr. Cooper?
No.
Mr. Cooper, no. Mr. Rogers?
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Courtney?
No.
Mr. Courtney, no. Mr. Conaway?
Aye.
Mr. Conaway, aye. Mr. Garamendi?
Aye.
Mr. Garamendi? Mr. Garamendi, no. Mr. Lamborn?
Aye.
Mr. Lamborn, aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear, no. Mr. Whitman?
Aye.
Mr. Whitman, aye. Ms. Gabbard?
No.
Ms. Gabbard, no. Mrs. Hartzler?
Aye.
Mrs. Hartzler, aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross, no. Mr. Scott?
Aye.
Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Gallego?
No.
Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Brooks?
Aye.
Mr. Brooks, aye. Mr. Moulton?
No.
No. Mr. Moulton, no. Mr. Cook?
Aye.
Mr. Cook, aye. Mr. Carbajal?
No.
Mr. Carbajal, no. Mr. Byrd?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Brown?
No.
Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Graves?
Aye.
Mr. Graves, aye. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Khanna? Ms. Stefanik?
Aye.
Ms. Stefanik?
Aye.
Aye. Mr. Keating?
No.
Mr. Keating, no. Dr. Desjardins?
Yes.
Dr. Desjardins, aye. Mr. Vella?
No.
Mr. Vella, no. Dr. Abraham?
Aye.
Dr. Abraham, aye. Mr. Kim?
No.
Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Kelly?
Aye.
Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Horn?
No.
Ms. Horn, no. Mr. Gallagher?
Aye.
Mr. Gallagher, aye. Mr. Cisneros?
No.
Mr. Cisneros, no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates, aye. Ms. Houlihan? Ms. Houlihan, no. Mr. Bacon?
Aye.
Mr. Bacon, aye. Mr. Crow?
No.
Mr. Crow, no. Mr. Banks?
Yes.
Mr. Banks, aye. Ms. Tori Small?
No.
Ms. Tori Small, no. Ms. Cheney?
Aye.
Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slotkin? Ms. Slotkin, no. Mr. Mitchell?
Aye.
Mr. Mitchell, aye. Ms. Cheryl? Ms. Cheryl, no. Mr. Bergman?
Aye.
Mr. Bergman, aye. Ms. Hill? Ms. Hill, no. Mr. Waltz?
Aye.
Mr. Waltz, aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar, no. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland, no. Mr. Golden? Mr. Golden, no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan, no. Mrs. Loria? Can the member repeat that? Mrs. Loria, no. Mr. Khanna? Mr. Khanna.
Has every member voted? Any member wish to change their vote? Clerk will report the tally.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 26 and the noes are 30.
The amendment is not agreed to. It's now in order to consider Mr. Turner's amendment 003. And I'm sorry, I got to look back. What does 003 do? Yeah. SM3 block 2. SM3 test. Say? The SM3 test. Oh, SM3 block 2 test debate. And the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Smith. Chairman Smith, no. Mr. Thornberry.
Aye.
Mr. Thornberry, aye. Mrs. Davis. No. Mrs. Davis, no. Mr. Wilson.
Aye.
Mr. Wilson, aye. Mr. Langevin.
No.
Mr. Langevin, no. Mr. Bishop.
Aye.
Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Turner.
Aye.
Mr. Turner, aye. Mr. Cooper.
No.
Mr. Cooper, no. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Courtney.
No.
Mr. Courtney, no. Mr. Conaway.
Aye.
Mr. Conaway, aye. Mr. Garamendi.
No.
Mr. Garamendi, no. Mr. Lamborn.
Aye.
Mr. Lamborn, aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear, no. Mr. Whitman.
Aye.
Mr. Whitman, aye. Ms. Gabbard.
No.
Ms. Gabbard, no. Mr. Hartzler. Mrs. Hartzler.
Yes.
Mrs. Hartzler, aye. Mr. Norcross. Mr. Norcross, no. Mr. Scott.
Aye.
Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Gallego.
No.
Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Brooks.
Aye.
Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
Aye.
Mr. Moulton.
Aye.
Mr. Moulton, aye. Mr. Cook.
Aye.
Mr. Cook, aye. Mr. Carbajal.
No.
Mr. Carbajal, no. Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Brown.
No.
Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Graves.
Aye.
Mr. Graves, aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna. Ms. Stefanik.
Aye.
Ms. Stefanik,
Aye.
aye. Mr. Keating.
No.
Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins.
Aye.
Dr. Desjardins, aye. Mr. Vella.
No.
Mr. Vella, no. Dr. Abraham.
Aye.
Dr. Abraham, aye. Mr. Kim.
No.
Mr. Kim, no. Mr. Kelly.
Aye.
Mr. Kelly, aye. Ms. Horn. Can the member repeat the vote? Oh, pass, sorry. Okay, Mr. Gallagher.
Aye.
Mr. Gallagher, aye. Mr. Cisneros.
No.
Mr. Cisneros, no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates, aye. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan, aye. Mr. Bacon.
Aye.
Mr. Bacon, aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow, no. Mr. Banks.
Yes.
Mr. Banks, aye. Ms. Torrey Small.
No.
Ms. Torrey Small, no. Ms. Cheney.
Aye.
Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slotkin.
Aye.
Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Mitchell.
Aye.
Mr. Mitchell, aye. Ms. Sherrill.
Aye.
Ms. Sherrill, aye. Mr. Bergman.
Aye.
Mr. Bergman, aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill, no. Mr. Waltz.
Aye.
Mr. Waltz, aye. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar, no. Ms. Holland.
No.
Ms. Holland, no. Mr. Golden.
Aye.
Mr. Golden, aye. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan, no. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria, no. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna. Ms. Horn.
Aye.
Ms. Horn, aye.
Have all members voted? Any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will report the tally.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 32 and the noes are 24.
The amendment is adopted. If there are no further amendments, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper, for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the subcommittee report of the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces as amended.
Questions on the motion? The gentleman from Tennessee, so many as in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been asked for. The clerk will call the roll.
Strange as that is.
Chairman Smith.
Aye.
Chairman Smith, aye. Mr. Thornberry. No. Mr. Thornberry, no. Mrs. Davis. Aye. Mrs. Davis, aye. Mr. Wilson. No. Mr. Wilson, no. Mr. Langevin. Aye. Mr. Langevin, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Larson. Aye. Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Turner. No. Mr. Turner, no. Mr. Cooper.
Aye.
Mr. Cooper, aye. Mr. Rogers. No. Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Courtney. Aye. Mr. Courtney, aye. Mr. Conaway. No. Mr. Conaway, no. Mr. Garamendi. Aye. Mr. Garamendi, aye. Mr. Lamborn. No. Mr. Lamborn, no. Ms. Spear. Aye. Ms. Spear, aye. Mr. Whitman. No. Mr. Whitman, no. Ms. Gabbard. Aye. Ms. Gabbard, aye. Mrs. Hartzler. No. Mrs. Hartzler, no. Mr. Norcross. Aye. Mr. Norcross, aye. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Gallego.
Aye.
Mr. Gallego, aye. Mr. Brooks.
No.
Mr. Brooks, no. Mr. Moulton.
Aye.
Mr. Moulton,
Not a
aye.
national conglomerate.
Mr. Cook.
No.
Mr. Cook, no. Mr. Carbajal.
Aye.
Mr. Carbajal, aye. Mr. Byrne.
No state.
Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Graves.
No.
Mr. Graves, no. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna. Ms. Stefanik. No. Ms. Stefanik, no. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating. Dr. Desjardins.
No.
Dr. Desjardins, no. Mr. Vella. Yes. Mr. Vella, aye. Dr. Abraham.
No.
Dr. Abraham, no. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim, aye. Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. Kelly, no. Ms. Horn. Aye. Ms. Horn, aye. Mr. Gallagher.
Nay.
Mr. Gallagher, no. Mr. Cisneros.
Aye.
Mr. Cisneros, aye. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates. Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan, aye. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon, no. Mr. Crow.
Aye.
Mr. Crow, aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks. Ms. Torrey Small. Ms. Torrey Small, aye. Ms. Cheney. No. Ms. Cheney, no. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Mitchell.
No.
Mr. Mitchell, no. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill, aye. Mr. Bergman.
No.
Mr. Bergman, no. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill, aye. Mr. Waltz.
No.
Mr. Waltz, no. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar, aye. Ms. Holland. Ms. Holland, aye. Ms. Holland, aye. Mr. Golden. Mr. Golden, aye. Mrs. Trahan. Mrs. Trahan, aye. Mrs. Luria. Mrs. Luria, aye. Mr. Khanna. Mr. Khanna, Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks.
Lawmakers voted. Member Cheney for the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes are 29, the noes are 24.
The subcommittee mark is adopted.
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
Yes.
Mr. Larson told me that if I had said hell no, that would have counted as a double vote. Is that accurate?
It's about as accurate as most things, Mr. Larson will tell you this. So take that for what it's worth. So, all right. Second to regroup here as we move on to the next section. The committee will now consider the chairman's mark pursuant to Committee Rule 17 in consultation with the ranking member. We will postpone recorded votes on amendments until the conclusion of our debate. All right. And now it's my job to make an opening statement. So I made the opening statement about 12 hours ago. Don't feel the need to repeat it at great length, except to say this. I think we've had very good debate to this point, and clearly you can see the couple of areas where we disagree. But again, I would remind members this is a very long bill, and at this point now we're deeply into the debate, and I can say with some confidence that we're in agreement on about 98% of it. And there are enormously important parts to this mark, including, I will emphasize, if we don't pass our bill, the troops do not get their 3.1% pay raise. We've discussed a little bit on the readiness part, the work that we have done to try to address the housing crisis and concerns. Sea Power Subcommittee funds important new ships and submarines. The TAC Air mark supports a large number of issues. The readiness mark helps keep us moving forward on readiness. And it is important to point out the amount of progress we've made from where we were 3-4 years ago in terms of the number of our units in all of our services that are now ready compared to where they were before. We need to keep building on that progress. And I know we're going to have a debate later on about 733 versus 750, but it's worth noting that 733, by a reasonably comfortable margin, is the largest defense budget we will have ever passed in Congress, and is a significant improvement on where we were before we got the budget agreement, the CAPS deal for 2018 and 2019, and where we are now. So we'll have that debate, but overall, I will again emphasize how important it is that we pass this bill. There are hundreds of provisions in here that are crucially important to members of this committee and to the Department of Defense and to the men and women who serve to enable them to continue to do their job. And we're going to have a little bit of debate here on full committee amendments. Once we get through that, I would strongly urge all members to support the full committee mark. And with that, I will yield to Mr. Thornberry for any opening statement he has.
Mr. Chairman, I would just say I agree. It's very important that we pass this bill. It's even more important that we pass a good bill. And I think we have lots of significant issues ahead of us in the full committee portion. And I hope that this bill gets better as the night goes on. And I'll save the rest of the debates until the appropriate time.
All right. Now we are rolling through a lot of amendments. And the first amendment up on the board is log 450R1. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition, Ms. Escobar?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
It's right at the top, I think. Is it? Do you have the wrong list? Mine are. Sorry, we pause for just a second. I think we may have differing lists. Do you not have Ms. Escobar at the top of our?
Sorry, go ahead.
We'll go ahead, but can we get Mr. Thornberry an updated version of the tracker here so we're on the same page? The clerk will distribute the amendment without objection. Reading of the amendment is waived, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have in my hand the Department of Defense's climate study, which was published in January, and that showed a majority of mission-critical bases that they reviewed to be threatened by climate change. Indeed, it is something that we've discussed at length in our committee and subcommittee. That study lacked some required details, which I am very grateful will be addressed elsewhere in this bill. Even in its current state, the study does confirm that the risk is real and prevalent and demands a systematic and urgent response. This year, several of our military installations struggled to recover from the damages caused by last year's hurricanes and floods. Normal work was disrupted, and service members were left trying to pick up the pieces. Much of this could have been avoided with better planning, and it is our oversight responsibility to make sure that happens because we know climate change impacts our readiness, and we have seen that. My amendment would simply require the department to standardize how it measures climate-related risks to military assets. The Department of Defense is free to develop a tool that makes sense for them, and it will allow installation managers and planners to better prioritize resources. It will protect taxpayer investments, and it will ensure readiness, so that we can avoid these devastating impacts to installations and disruptions to the work of our military in the future. The tool would provide a common measure for how climate change impacts military networks, systems, installations, facilities, and other assets. And it would push us to get serious about what the impacts to operational plans and capabilities are so that we can meet this threat head on. By getting clear about the relative needs and the specific impacts, we will be able to effectively counter the threat posed by changing and extreme weather. I urge my colleagues to support this very common sense amendment. And before I yield back, I want to wish a very happy birthday to my legislative director, Jacqueline, who's in the audience and spending her birthday in NDAA markup fun. I yield back.
Right. And we're not going to sing. Thought about it for a second there, but I think that'd be a bad precedent. So is there further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, all.
Chairman,
I'm sorry, yes.
Could we just hold on for just a second?
Sure.
Since we just rearranged all the amendments, we're kind of scrambling to see what's.
Well, no,
Just
that's
hold
fine.
on for a second.
I will. I had asked to do that, and that we would wait until you got there. So I'm happy to do that. Yes.
It's just a completely different order.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, we have time.
It's figured out. Who has you ready to go? Did we hand out? Did we hand out? That's why I want to
All right, I believe we are ready. Is there further discussion on Ms. Escobar's amendment? Hearing none, all those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. And if we could get up on the screen there the order so that all members know what's coming here. We've got a lot of amendments in the full committee mark, and it's going to be good to give members a warning as to what's coming. It will adjust at some point. It is now in order to consider log 500. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
I have an amendment on the desk and on the screen, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. The clerk will distribute the amendment without objection. Reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized to discuss his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment before you requires the Secretary of Defense to report on the feasibility and cost for the Department of Defense to achieve net zero greenhouse emissions, as would be required if the Green New Deal, I'll call that HRES 109, were enacted into law. For those who say HRES 109 will never become law because it is totally impractical and we shouldn't spend time on it, I will point out that we have many candidates for president that are making it part of the national debate. 17 of them having endorsed the Green New Deal. We have members of this committee that have endorsed HRES 109. So I think it's worth getting a report from the Department of Defense on how energy and climate policy in that resolution would interplay with national security. What would it actually mean to achieve net zero emissions and make America carbon neutral in 11 years? Could the Department of Defense even do this? What would be the impact to the military's ability to implement the National Defense Strategy? And how much would this cost? We should have answers to these questions. So that's what this amendment would do. For context, renewable energy currently accounts for 17% of domestic energy production. Within this 17%, wind accounts for less than 7% and solar for less than 2%. And besides that 17% on renewables, nuclear power accounts for 19.3% and fossil fuels provide 63.5%. Don't get me wrong, I think most of us support clean energy, but not if it undermines our economy and makes our national defense vulnerable. From 2005 to 2017, the United States cut CO2 emissions by 14%. During that same period, China increased theirs by 70%. So I personally believe that we must push the military to continuously improve both institutional and operation energy efficiency. It's good for the environment, it's good for our taxpayers, and it's good for national security. For example, every fuel convoy that we take off of a road in combat reduces risk to troops, reduces sustainment, and reduces the demand for strategic lift. So I ask that members support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I recognize myself. The main problem, I don't really have a problem with the net zero emissions part of this. The problem with, examining what implementing the Green New Deal will have effect on military readiness is the Green New Deal is a sense of Congress. It's not a piece of legislation. It does not specify any particular action. It sets the goal of creating legislation that can get us to the place that Mr. Lamborn just described. So there's really nothing for the Department of Defense to analyze. It doesn't say you have to do this or you have to do that. The purpose of the Green New Deal is to set the stage for legislation to be introduced. And if that legislation is introduced, it will be considered. So that's one problem and one reason I oppose the amendment. The second thing is, when it comes to fossil fuels, and we've had this debate in this committee many, many times, Mr. Conaway and I usually go back and forth on this. If you simply look at it, what's the cheapest way to do it right now? And if that's the only analysis, well, fossil fuels are going to win every single time because we've been subsidizing the hell out of them for about 175 years. They have a massive infrastructure built to support them, and that's where we're going to go. But the point is, we need to make the investments so that we are not dependent upon fossil fuels. And we can study the impact of being dependent on fossil fuels and what that has on readiness as well. If you believe in climate change, if you believe that digging up things from below the ground and burning them, as we do with fossil fuels, is leading towards the possible extinction of the planet, not to mention all kinds of different bad impacts on our national security. We've seen the extreme weather events. We've seen, places that are now bases that are now more underwater than they used to be. If you believe in all that, we've got to take steps to try to stop that from happening. And if it's a zero-sum game, well, if it's cheaper, we're not going to make the change, then we are dooming ourselves to a bad future. Now, if you don't believe in climate change, you don't believe all that's going to happen, okay, that's a debate. But I do believe that climate change is a grave national threat that we need to address, and a threat to us, a threat to our national security in a whole series of ways. So a study like this would basically say, don't address it. Think short term, not long term. What gets us through the day as opposed to what enables us to maintain life on the planet. So I don't think this is a good idea, and I oppose the amendment. Further discussion. Mr. Garamendi? I'm sorry. If you want recognition, you got to just say, you look at me like, yeah, if you want to call on
Chairman,
me, it's
if I
okay.
might, I'll try to do this quickly.
Okay, go ahead.
This would fall within the work of the Readiness Subcommittee. I want to really commend Mr. Lamborn for the work that he did in the subcommittee to deal with much of what he's asking to be done here. The HR 109 has been referred to 11 committees in the House. I suppose if it were referred to this committee, we would be taking it up next year or as soon as they finish the work tonight. And that'd be fine with me because there are many things that are here. The chairman pretty well laid out my arguments on this. But I would just note for the committee's work and attention that the readiness mark that's now been approved by the full committee really addresses almost everything here. And we're glad to have Mr. Lamborn have an opportunity to speak to HR 109 and his concerns about it. However, we've done a lot of the work already, so let's move on and get on with the other amendments. I yield back.
Further discussion. Hearing none, all those in favor, I'm sorry. Mr. Langeman.
Okay, I think it's on now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to reiterate the points that you made earlier. The Green New Deal is not a bill. It's just a sense of Congress. It's a aspirational document, if you will, laying out a set of principles, which I think are laudable and noteworthy, and certainly do call attention to the challenges that we face as a nation due to the effects of climate change. I know that in the last two Congresses, we have dealt with this as a committee, and in the 2018 NDAA, I had offered an amendment which was accepted on a bipartisan basis, acknowledging that climate change is a threat to U.S. national security, and we need to do an assessment of how it's affecting our bases, our military planning, and such. So the Green New Deal is certainly an important aspirational document laying out important principles of the things that we need to look at in terms of how we get to zero net emissions. But there really is nothing at this point to study, since it's not a bill in the sense of the word that we would deal with as a committee. So while I appreciate Mr. Lamborn's intent, it's a little premature. Let's wait for a bill, and if that's the case, then it'd be appropriate at that time to consider perhaps an amendment, but not at this time. So with that, I would have to oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Further discussion. Ms. Houlihan.
I really have no real opposition to a report, but I do have a bit of an opposition to this language of the last two sentences, I guess the last sentence of the first paragraph, which states of the devastating effect of military readiness, and that feels like there's a conclusion without the report actually even happening. And so I just was wondering if that sort of language was fungible, if we could talk about that.
Further discussion. Mr. Moulton.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like to speak as someone who has signed on in support of the concept of the Green New Deal, because I do think that we must make addressing climate change a priority. But I do not agree with all the provisions that have been preliminarily put forth by some of the Green New Deal proponents. I think that studying the effects on the Department of Defense is a reasonable thing to do, because we should understand the facts here. But I share the chairman's concern that we simply don't have a concrete proposal that really exists as the Green New Deal to study. I also share Ms. Houlihan's concerns about the preemptive conclusions of this amendment. So I do want to praise Mr. Lamborn for bringing this up, for wanting to address the science here. We should want to understand the science and how it impacts our national security. I'm just not sure this is the right way to go about it. I yield back.
Further discussion? All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Record vote is requested. We will suspend discussion of this until the end of the mark. Next up is log 376. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment on the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment. If there's no objection, we'll waive reading, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe in focusing our resources towards those efforts which make our forces more effective, reliable, and efficient. I introduced this amendment to ensure we do just that. In the current version of this bill, $20 million is allocated to a program to develop low-enriched uranium fuel for naval nuclear propulsion, submarines, and aircraft carriers. Drawing on my 20-year Navy experience in the supervision and operation of these naval nuclear propulsion systems and the simple facts of size and weight in submarine design, it makes little sense to divert resources from our successful high-enriched uranium program that has been improved and refined over more than 6 decades. I will read from correspondence by the Secretaries of the Navy and the Secretary of Energy and Director of Naval Reactors with concurring opinions on this matter in a letter dated 25 March 2018. The operational needs of United States Navy submarines and aircraft carriers place a high importance on the reactor core energy density. The replacement of highly enriched uranium with low enriched uranium would result in a reactor design that is inherently less capable, more expensive, and unlikely to support current life of ship submarine reactors. The low-enriched uranium fuel system would affect operational availability of military assets due to necessary refueling and will require significant new shipyard infrastructure. Funding development work of this magnitude is not possible without increasing risk to other existing naval nuclear propulsion efforts. A program to pursue research and development of a low-enriched uranium advanced fuel system would compete for necessary resources against all other DoD priorities as part of a future budget request. One may argue that the use of high-enriched uranium is a nuclear proliferation issue and a security threat. If that argument is used, I beg to see what additional resources are proposed to solve this problem in today's budget. Others may argue that other countries use low-enriched uranium in their propulsion designs, but I would respond that the world does not rely on those other countries to provide a reliable nuclear deterrent whose delivery is assured by our SSBN fleet and the reliability of these very nuclear propulsion systems from which this effort would divert critical resources. Lastly, some may argue that $20 million is a small amount in the scope of a $730 million plus defense budget. However, this is an initial investment in a program that is assured to, quote, negatively impact reactor endurance, reactor size, and ship costs, end quote, by Admiral Caldwell, Director of Naval Reactors, as a first expenditure in a $1 billion plus program spanning 15 years in which success is, quote unquote, not assured. I can also say that for our operational forces, $20 million is no small amount. When I served as the executive officer of a guided missile cruiser during sequestration, and sailors were scrounging for funds to buy their own toilet paper and basic supplies, $20 million would have made a world of difference across our operational waterfront. For that reason, I consulted with Navy leadership about what program shows high risk to complete on budget and on time and carries significant operational impact. And I very deliberately recommend this $20 million be placed in the ship maintenance and repair line item, supporting the overhaul of USS Boise. I will conclude as I began. We need to commit our limited resources where they are most efficiently used to support our operational forces and our national defense. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Is there any debate on the issue? Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would like to speak in strong favor of this amendment. I'd like to urge my colleagues to do the same. I think Ms. Luria brings up some very, very valid points. The bottom line is this: the additional cost associated with low enriched uranium creates challenges for the Navy in the billions of dollars over the lifetime of these ships. Also, it reduces operational availability. So we're looking at increasing as the measure goes A sub O, operational availability, and this reduces that. The ships will spend more time in port being refueled. It will cost more. If you look at nuclear submarines, it will increase the times they have to be in port to be refueled. That's a cost not only to the nation, but it's a cost in terms of that ship being at sea. The same with a nuclear aircraft carrier. It will have to go back to port and be refueled one more time during its life. A complex refueling and overhaul for a nuclear aircraft carrier is $4 billion. Add that times the carriers we have, take that for the time it takes them in port, 2 years to be refueled, and you see what happens with operational availability for our ships. I understand the reasons behind wanting to look at low enriched uranium. Studies in 2014 has shown through naval reactors that it would impact reactor endurance, reactor size, and ship costs. Reactors would have to be bigger. The cost for our ships go up. The operational availability goes down. Also, in 2016, a report came to us that said it would result in reduced reactor life, problems too with ship operations, especially on existing ships. The Secretary of Energy and Secretary of the Navy in a report March 25th of 2018 indicated the replacement of highly enriched uranium with low enriched uranium would result in reactor design that is inherently less capable, more expensive, and unlikely to support current life of ship submarine reactors, which means we get less life out of those submarines, which means we either have to spend more to extend their life. And remember, ships like submarines, when they go to depth, experience compression on the steel, which means it can only do that so many times before you have a end of life of the submarine. If now you take that out because of having to put another reactor in, or now have to create a larger reactor to put in that ship just to make sure that it can go to its expected life, we either have one or two things: extraordinarily increased cost or less ship life, which means we have to build new ships sooner. All of those scenarios, not good things for us to get to a 355 ship Navy, not a good thing for us to look at how do we get the most out of our ships, not a good thing when we're looking at sailors wanting to be at sea on deployment, not at the dock, waiting for ships to be rebuilt, to be refueled. Again, all of these things directly affect the operational capability of our Navy. And let me say this: there is probably nobody in this room that has more direct experience and what it's like to be at sea and making sure that a ship is operational than Ms. Luria from the state of Virginia. I would urge all of my colleagues to listen closely to her assessment of what this means for our Navy and what it means for us to get to a 355 ship Navy. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Further discussion.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I regretfully oppose the amendment due to the offset, which decreases the research and development funding for a vital nuclear nonproliferation program. So this committee has supported this efforts going back since 2013. The setting line relates to a program that assesses the viability of using low enriched uranium in naval reactors. First of all, nothing requires this yet. It would have to meet Navy specifications and performance requirements, including those in aircraft carriers and submarines. So as you may know, the United States has demonstrated strong leadership over the past decade to minimize and where possible at all, but eliminate the use of highly enriched uranium for civilian purposes. Doing so reduces the risk of nuclear terrorism. It makes clear that the accumulation of HEU is military in nature, isolating nation states seeking nuclear weapons capability. So using low enriched uranium in a naval reactor fuel could bring significant national security benefits with respect to nuclear nonproliferation. It could also lower security costs and naval reactor research and development at the cutting edge of nuclear science. Pursuing the development of LEU offers the opportunity to achieve transformational progress on fuel technology. Additionally, unless an alternative using low-enriched uranium fuel is developed in the coming decades, the United States will have to resume production of bomb-grade uranium for the first time since 1992, ultimately undermining U.S. nonproliferation efforts. So using LEU for naval reactors is not a pipe dream. France's nuclear navy already has converted from HEU to LEU, and we must evaluate the feasibility of a similar transition for the U.S. Navy and take into account the potential benefits to U.S. and international security of setting a norm for using LEU instead of nuclear bomb grade material. As America confronts the threat of nuclear terrorism and as countries continue to enrich uranium for naval purposes, the imperative to reduce the use of HEU will become increasingly important over the next several decades. It's therefore critical that this committee fund this critical research as we have done since 2013. Again, that is paramount to our national security interests. The time is now, and if we do not act soon to begin a transition, we're going to lock ourselves into using systems that rely on uranium found in nuclear weapons, not reactors. If we're forced to restart enrichment, non-proliferation goals could be set back a century or more. So again, it requires that if we were to do this, that we would meet Navy requirements. Nothing undermines Navy requirements, and we checked with with naval reactors, and they do not oppose funding on this as a nuclear non-proliferation amendment. The funds come out of NNSA, not out of naval reactors. So these are already funds that were intended for non-proliferation purposes. And again, I think it's the right thing to do. The committee has supported this effort since 2013, and it would only be a step backwards if we were to cut the funding for this vital program. So with that, I would oppose the amendment, urge my colleagues to oppose as well.
Mr. Moulton.
Mr. Chairman, I share Mr. Langevin's both his concerns about nuclear nonproliferation and his desire to ensure that America is always leading on this issue. I think that is essential. But I respectfully disagree with him in his position on this amendment because I think the physics is pretty clear here. And there's no evidence that having highly enriched uranium here in the United States has been a source of proliferation concerns. There's a lot of nuclear proliferation concerns around the globe. It doesn't come from the highly enriched uranium that we use to fuel our submarines. It's also pretty obvious per the physics that if you use low enriched uranium, you need a lot more of it. And that's a proliferation concern in and of itself. We also just went through quite a bit of debate about how important it is to have an absolutely essential survivable leg of the nuclear triad in our SSBNs. And I don't think we'd want to do anything to weaken that. There are a lot of people on my side of the aisle who supported that argument against some of the pro-nuclear arguments from the Republicans. While I wish that Ms. Luria had chosen an alternative for the funds for this, I know Marines and soldiers who dream of the option of purchasing their own toilet paper. I support her amendment and think it's a smart thing for our Navy and for our national defense. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Further discussion? Ms. Hill, I'm sorry. And then Ms. Hill.
Thank you. I yield my time to my colleague from Virginia, Ms. Luria.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Whitman, my fellow colleague from Virginia, as well as Mr. Moulton. I think we can rely on the physics majors here in the room to know that the low enriched uranium at 20% enrichment versus the current 93% enrichment that we use for high enriched uranium, the reactor would have to be just nuke math, 5 times as big or last 1/5 as long. So I think that the argument that we're using, that we have a threat of nuclear terrorism based off the high enriched uranium that we're using for our nuclear propulsion purposes is unrealistic. And as I said in my earlier comments, if that is a concern, I think we should be looking at other ways to dedicate more security to securing that fuel against threats of nuclear terrorism. And again, I also reiterate the non-equivalence between the fact that some other countries, including our allies, have used low-enriched uranium themselves for their propulsion. Those allies, although critical in completing our goals and working alongside NATO, do not have the same operational requirements or restrictions that we do. And the world relies on our continuous presence of our SSBNs for a nuclear deterrent. So trying to find an alternate technology to power those that's less efficient, more costly, goes in direct conflict to my strong support for maintaining our nuclear deterrent, which in fact is provided by a delivery platform of the SSBN using exactly this technology. I yield the remainder of my time back to Ms. Hill.
Thank you. I yield back to the chair.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, just want to say that I think this is sort of like a family discussion here because there is no one who I think has shown over the years his support for our nuclear submarine force than Mr. Langevin, who has been a member of the Sea Power subcommittee for longer than almost anyone else, I think, on the subcommittee. And again, has been a consistent supporter for recapitalizing our attack submarine fleet, our SSBN fleet, and also in terms of, getting the repair and availabilities moving faster for the Los Angeles class submarines, which again, the Boise is one of those LA class submarines. I'm puzzled by this amendment in terms of that second part of it, in terms of allocating the money towards Boise. There is no question Boise has been stranded in the NAVSEA fiasco in terms of getting submarines turned around in a somewhat appropriate time period. And there's no question that Boise, Hartford, and Columbus actually are all Los Angeles class submarines that have taken far too long. With Mr. Whitman, we have asked CBO and GAO to look at this problem in terms of the public shipyards, not turning these boats around. And in fact, they found exactly what we suspected, which is that if they had moved some of this work to private yards, those subs would be deployed today rather than waiting in the queue for work at the submarine shipyard. There has been an underfunding requirement for this, so that certainly is also the backdrop here. I would just note, however, if you look at the Navy's request in terms of unfunded requirements for ship depot maintenance, it was $815 million. That's what came over from the Navy, and $653 million of that was for submarines, for Columbus, Hartford, and Boise. We are funding that in the readiness account fully. I mean, every penny of that request that came over from the Navy is in the readiness account. We actually did adjust the Virginia class account for the third sub because we couldn't spend all that money in 2020 and helped Mr. Garamendi address that issue. So, the decision to put 20,000 more into that account just for that one sub when we got 2 others, by the way, again, I'm not sure how that decision was done. It certainly wasn't done with the Navy's report in terms of what they need to get those ships turned around. Again, Mr. Langevin has worked on this issue. As he points out, this is research dollars that have go back to 2013 in a different account. And again, just because of just how this money is being spent and the fact that there's a history here, I'm not comfortable supporting this amendment. And again, I say it as someone who agrees that we got to get these Los Angeles class subs moving. And in fact, that's exactly what the MARC and readiness is going to do by fully funding that request. So again, I will respectfully oppose this amendment. And again, I'm sure this conversation is going to continue on lower enriched uranium. It's something that has been going on for a number of years. I think everyone would agree if you could really find it, so a solution that would use it and have the same effectiveness as high enriched, I think we would all be happy with that outcome. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Lamborn.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. I wanted to speak to this, and I want to, first of all, give a shout out to the chairman of the Sea Power and Projection Forces Subcommittee, who's been relentless about making sure that ship maintenance gets funded. And listen, I agree with him concerning the element of how the money is directed towards the USS Boise. But if you look at it, money within that county is fungible. There is a $200 million deficit in ship readiness. So while you can make an argument that this is specific to the Boise and that the Boise was included in other language there, the money in the account is fungible. So if this money goes towards Boise, it frees up other money in the account for us to be able to use for ship maintenance. I would argue the backlog that we've had on ship maintenance availabilities, that money can be well utilized to make sure that we catch up in ship maintenance and that we actually get ahead a little bit. And actually through the years, we have gone behind. And I know that if you go to yards, both in Mr. Courtney's district and my district and districts across the United States, you'll find that they are today full with ships undergoing maintenance. And some of that maintenance has been delayed. So I would argue these dollars actually have a lot of utility going into that account, especially since there is a deficit there. And this money can very easily get to the places where it needs to be to do ship maintenance that is indeed backlogged. So I think that this is actually a great place for the dollars to be. And I would urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back to Mr. Lamborn.
And I yield back.
Okay. I just want you to know only one side is going to get the last word in this debate, no matter how it goes. So if we could, we've debated this rather robustly at this point. So if there are further comments, if we could make them on the quick side, that would be much appreciated. There's a lot to get to. And with that, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, the gentlelady, for yielding. I'll be brief. First of all, I will just underscore what Mr. Courtney said, that the funding for the USS Boise has been fully met. And so there is not the need to put the $20 million toward operation maintenance for that vessel, because there's already been that funding level has already been met. I just want to say in closing, on the R&D side, that's what R&D is for. It may not be appropriate today in terms of being able to meet naval requirements, although again, the French and the Chinese use LEU instead of HEU, but that is the whole purpose of research and development, to make that determination. And we will learn significantly from the R&D work that is done, and there will be countless, I'm sure, a spin-off or untold benefits from the research. You think about people over the years who have said, well, let's keep doing it the way we'd always done it, because that's the way it's done. Well, if we had done that, I'm sure there are people years ago that said, a computer that filled a large room is fine. It's doing its work. And why do research and development to try to shrink the size of the computer, go from tape to digital? So I would say that R&D here is essential. If we can reduce our dependence on HEU and continue to lead the world, and by example, showing that we can use LEU as opposed to HEU, and it has benefits for not only in national security, but also in research and development in other areas. I think this is something that we should support. The committee, as I said, has supported it since 2013, and I would encourage my colleagues to oppose the amendment and continue to support this type of R&D work.
All right, thank you. Question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Getting the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is defeated.
Mr. Chairman.
She's calling. Yeah. Recorded vote has been requested. I suspect it's not going to go well. Anyway, all right.
Yeah.
We will hold the vote until the end of the discussion.
Yeah.
It is now in order to consider log one. Well, we're going to go to log 160. And for what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will pass out the amendment. Without objection, it will be considered as read. The general lady is recognized to discuss her amendment. This was one that was in the Milpers mark that was moved to full committee, and it's back, and we're
It's
discussing
back.
it again. Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Ms. Hartzler and I met, and regrettably, we are just not on the same page. So the amendment, as I presented it earlier today, stands. We have just a philosophical difference. Ms. Hartzler believes that emergency contraception is an abortifacient. It is not. It's wrong and really goes against longstanding opinions by the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, who define emergency contraception as a form of contraception. They say that it is oftentimes confused with medication-induced abortion. Medication-induced abortion is used to terminate an existing pregnancy. All types of emergency contraception are effective only before a pregnancy is established and therefore are not abortifacients. So attempts to call emergency contraception as abortifacients is frankly an attempt to undermine science. And I think any woman, any military service woman who has been sexually assaulted and comes for services and is given the full panoply of emergency contraception should be able to access it, pure and simple.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a substitute amendment at the desk I'd like to offer.
Will the clerk please distribute the amendment? This one we had some advance notice on, so it should be on your computer. You should have it in front of you. We will dispense with reading of the amendment. Ms. Hartzler is recognized to discuss.
Great.
I'm sorry, one quick thing. We're going to have to vote on this as soon as this debate is done. So if you're not here and you're listening somewhere, you need to get here. Go ahead, Ms. Hartzler.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I appreciate my friend and colleague for visiting with me about this. My amendment does not strike any of the language by the chairwoman. It simply gives women more information. And I think this is reasonable and it's beneficial for the women in the military service. This subject is certainly a very sensitive subject. We're talking about women who have been sexually assaulted. It is unconscionable and is upsetting to even think about. Very difficult subject. But what Representative Spears' amendment does, it says that the Secretary of Defense shall promptly furnish to sexual assault survivors at each military medical treatment facility the following. And then it says it provides comprehensive, medically factually accurate, unbiased written and oral information about all methods of emergency contraception approved by the Food and Drug Administration. My amendment would give them even more information. And the reason I would go on and to give that woman information also about pregnancy support services for women who might find emergency contraception objectionable. And the definition of pregnancy support services includes government and non-government entities that provide information, counseling, and resources related to pregnancy and the benefits, rights, and services pregnant service women are entitled to. The reason I think it's important that service women be provided with this information as well is because many service women do believe that life begins at conception. And we can have a disagreement about the specifics of Plan B and Ella, but even the FDA says, how does Plan B work? Well, it works like other birth control pills to prevent pregnancy, and that's what Representative Spears is saying. It's a pure contraception. But the FDA also goes on and says that if fertilization does occur, Plan B may prevent a fertilized egg from attaching to the womb, implantation. So for many women of conscience, they believe that once fertilization occurs, it is life. It is a baby, a little baby, that if implanted would have the opportunity to have a plan and purpose and life. And so as women have gone through this traumatic event and they are very vulnerable and they go to the medical facility and the Department of Defense doctors are sitting down with them, I think they deserve to not only get the information that Representative Spears is saying that they need or that she's proposing, that they get methods of emergency contraception, so they learn about the option of Plan B. Her amendment also says they're given a prescription if they want one. Right. But also, why not share with them other options? First of all, their rights. If they should become pregnant, what are their rights as a servicewoman? To be able to carry that baby to full term? What supports are available there on base for her if that is something she wants to do after she's consulted and thought about it and talked to those near her about what her future looks like and what she wants to do, what she should do? Why should she be denied this important information at this very critical, vulnerable time? And all my amendment is saying it does nothing to take away from what Representative Spear wants to give them, the information. It just gives them more information about their rights, more services that are available to them. And I think that's a good thing. And I would ask my colleagues that this is surely something we all can agree on, come together, that our servicewomen in this very difficult time are entitled to as much information as possible as they deal and grapple with what has happened to them and their options going forward. So I would ask everyone to support my substitute amendment, and then let's move on. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am speaking against the substitute and for the underlying amendment. Indeed, women who have been assaulted are vulnerable, and they are going through something incredibly horrible. But when they are specifically and explicitly seeking and requesting emergency contraception, the last thing they would want to hear is counseling that runs counter to what they are requesting. They've already been traumatized. This would only re-traumatize them. I cannot speak strongly enough against the substitute. I support Mrs. Spears' amendment. I would be happy to yield to my colleague from California.
Thank you. I think we just have to remember the time frame that this is happening in. The only time that Plan B is effective is within 72 hours of unplanned intercourse. And that means that you have just been sexually assaulted. You're going in because you do not want to become pregnant from that. You don't want to talk about whether you're going to bear a child from that. You don't have any idea. You won't have any idea for at least 6 weeks if you are going to become pregnant from that. So the thought of finding out what your options are of becoming a mother in the military, or of having to carry a baby to term that came from that sexual assault is horrifying to even have to go through your mind. All you know right then is that you were raped and you do not want to get pregnant from it. So the idea of having to provide more information in this moment when women are absolutely horrified and are thinking about nothing more than their own basic survival and the ability for them to move on with their lives, and prevent, the absolute worst that could happen to them in that very moment from occurring, is, to me, we have to support the underlying amendment and oppose the replacement. Thank you. I yield back to Ms. Escobar.
Thank you. I want to remind my colleagues that the vulnerable state that a victim is in, and the fact that we need to respect a victim's desire to seek contraception, which again is intended to prevent pregnancy in a case when she has been raped. And so I would urge that we reject the substitute and support Ms. Spears' amendment. I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to briefly say this is the National Defense Authorization Act. And if we want to turn it into a partisan issue on social issues, that certainly seems to be the way we're headed down. And I'm sorry to see that. I think Ms. Hartzler amendment is really doesn't ask for a whole lot other than to provide additional information. It provides additional information. It doesn't require any counseling or anything along those lines. And I would like to yield my time to my colleague, Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. I just wanted to clarify something that was said. At the point that my amendment, these women are not requesting a prescription for emergency contraception, and then they are in the doctor's office because they have been sexually assaulted. And that's at the point Representative Spears' amendment is almost pushing them proactively, having the doctor immediately say, here's how to get emergency contraception, here's how to do it, and here, I'll give you a prescription if you want one. So my concern is that women are very vulnerable, and if this is the only option given to you, here's a prescription, here's what you can do. They don't have time to think about all the ramifications. And I'm just saying at that point, the doctor, yes, the military doctor can give them information about emergency contraception, but then also say, but we want you to know as well that there are services here that are available to you. There's counseling, there's this agency you could go to, this is this person, in case you feel and the way you were raised that perhaps you want to consider other options besides taking this prescription, which potentially could mean an abortion. So I just feel like it's important at that vulnerable state to give them that information. Then they can decide if they want a prescription or not. And certainly more information is not bad. It is helpful and good. I yield back to the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. I just, one quick comment, Ms. Scott's comment. The health care that our men and women who serve in the military receive is very much within our jurisdiction. And there are a lot of decisions that DOD make that impacts that health care. So this is not just raising some ancillary issue. It has an impact on our service members. So,
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you.
I will,
But this
I
is
will
also,
yield, Mr. Scott, I have to just pro forma here, my time. I'm happy to yield to the gentleman.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for speaking out of order.
Sorry.
But I agree with what you said. But this is the National Defense Authorization Act. This is a very big issue that has the potential. We've had this bill for years. For 50 plus years, we have brought this out in a bipartisan manner and passed it through the House of Representatives.
Not always bipartisan, but just historically.
But
most of the time, yes,
I would just say we have historically stayed away from putting things in the bill.
Yeah.
Well, I've only been here 9 years.
Yeah, the Russell Amendment a few years back was pretty much on that point.
Well,
So, yeah,
look, let me yield the time you yielded me back to you. I'm just, Ms. Hartzler's amendment does not stop what another colleague who I very much respect is trying to do. It simply says, in addition to that, there's going to be additional information provided.
Understood. We're claiming my time. We've got votes called. I've got Mr. Gallego and Ms. Stefanik. I think it would be awesome if the two of you were so brilliant that you wrapped up the debate and we were able to get it done, take a quick vote, and then go vote. So no pressure. But Mr. Gallego?
Thank you. And with all due respect to all my colleagues, I think it's absolutely crazy that we trust our women in the military to make snap decisions when it comes to other people's lives. But when it comes to their own lives, we actually are trying to set up extra requirements on them, right? This is not, it's just absurd to me that someone that's gone through such a traumatizing event, that we somehow think that they don't have full capacity enough for them to figure out what other options they have, when we're actually trying to just talk to them about a safe medical prescription that many people have identified not as an abortion. I understand where there may be some of my friends, especially my friend to my left, that we're talking about other types of issues, we're particularly maybe dealing with the Hyde Amendment, but this is not the Hyde Amendment. This is something that even women take before they even know they're pregnant, just in case they had gotten raped to the point where they don't want to end up finding themselves later dealing with a medical procedure such as an abortion. And more importantly, again, these women join the military. They entrust their lives to us. We trust their lives to them. Let's let them make the medical decisions they need to so they can actually continue serving their country and actually keep their dignity in such a horrible state. And I yield back my time.
I think it's really important to note that this amendment I support Ms. Hartzler's secondary amendment because it's about more information. Look, I have a strong record of supporting access to emergency contraception, access to birth control for our service women, but I think we should also include information about pregnancy support services. This is about more information. This does not limit access to emergency contraception, and I fully support Mrs. Hartzler's secondary amendment.
The question occurs on the substitute amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Opposed, no.
No.
No. Petty and chair, the noes have it. The substitute, and yes, we will have a recorded vote. Clerk will call the roll.
They have to ask.
Chairman Smith.
No.
Chairman Smith votes no. Mr. Thornberry. Mr. Thornberry votes aye. Mrs. Davis.
But she.
Mrs. Davis.
No.
Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Langevin. Mr. Langevin.
It's contraception.
Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Larson. No. Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Turner. Mr. Turner. Mr. Cooper. No. Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Courtney. No. Mr. Courtney votes no. Mr. Conaway. Aye. Mr. Conaway votes aye. Mr. Garamendi.
No.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Aye. Mr. Lamborn votes aye. Ms. Spear.
No.
Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Whitman.
Aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard. Mrs. Hartzler. Yes. Mrs. Hartzler votes yes. Mr. Norcross. Yes. Mr. Norcross votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes yes. Mr. Gallego.
No.
Mr. Gallego votes no. Mr. Brooks.
Aye.
Mr. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Moulton.
No.
Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Cook. Mr. Cook votes aye. Mr. Carbajal.
No.
Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Brown.
No.
Mr. Brown votes no. Mr. Graves.
Aye.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Khanna.
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Ms. Stefanik.
Aye.
Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Keating. Mr. Keating votes no. Dr. Desjardins.
Aye.
Dr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Vella. Mr. Vella votes no. Dr. Abraham.
Aye.
Dr. Abraham votes aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim votes no. Mr. Kelly.
Aye.
Mr. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Horan. Ms. Horan votes no. Mr. Gallagher.
Aye.
Mr. Gallagher votes aye. Mr. Cisneros. Mr. Cisneros votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Gates votes aye.
I apologize if I can interrupt for a second. So this will be the last action we take before we recess to vote on the floor. So once you have voted, you are free to go until after the votes, then we get back as quickly as possible. Go ahead.
Ms. Houlihan. Ms. Houlihan votes no. Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon votes aye. Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow votes no. Mr. Banks.
Yes.
Mr. Banks votes aye. Ms. Torres Small. Ms. Torres Small votes no. Ms. Cheney. Aye. Ms. Cheney votes aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Mitchell.
No.
Mr. Mitchell votes no. Ms. Sherrill. Ms. Sherrill votes no. Mr. Bergman.
Aye.
Mr. Bergman votes aye. Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill votes no. Mr. Waltz.
Aye.
Mr. Waltz votes aye. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Holland? Ms. Holland votes no. Mr. Golden? Mr. Golden votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mrs. Loria? Mrs. Loria votes no. Mr. Langevin?
Agreed to cut the speeches down. At some point we get there.
Mr. Langevin?
We're just not there yet.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Turner? I have a lot more to say.
At some point, yeah, yes, no, I'm not pleased with it. I want
I'm gonna talk to them all, so he's got to say till I walk off. Walk off the road. He just told me he was like, I have to stay till I walk off the road. That's his issue. So.
On this vote, the ayes are 25 and the noes are 33.
Substitute member is defeated. It will now be ordered to go back to the original amendment, suspend that discussion. We are in recess until after the floor votes. Be a little more optimistic. They can do that. It'll be tomorrow. Another one says, walk off the floor. 1 a.m. I don't understand. I don't understand how that works. I don't. Sorry. I see your line.
Yes. Place somebody in the middle of the book. Oh, yeah, I know. At the end. No shot. Really standing this way.
The House Armed Services Committee is taking a recess for House votes. They will reconvene shortly. For now, we'll show you a portion of the committee meeting from earlier today as they consider the Defense Authorization Bill for fiscal year 2020.
And we are now going to consider on block package number 3, and I recognize Mr. Garamendi for the purpose of offering the on block amendment. John? Hello?
Mr. Chairman, my mother told me not to eat fast.
Oh, sorry.
Give me 10 seconds. Okay. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up on block package 3, consisting of amendments that have been worked out and approved with both the majority and the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. Will the clerk please distribute the en bloc amendment? Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, amendment number 73R3 by Mr. Larson on the firefighting property program. Amendment 77R1 by Mr. Cook on delivering 2 low-time serviceable FA-18s to NASA Armstrong Flight Research Center. Amendment number 95R1 by Ms. Torres Small on the state of unexploded ordinances on Indian reservations. Amendment number 98R1 by Mr. Bishop on direct hiring authority for positions that work on and support defense activities for the Defense Industrial Base or the Major Rain and Test Facility bases. Amendment 100R1 by Mr. Bishop on the utility, viability, cost effectiveness, and environmental benefit of continuing development of energy efficiency programs. Improvements for shelter number 3. Amendment number 110R1 by Mr. Brown on the vulnerabilities to cover installations located outside the continental United States and combat commander requirements resulting from environmental risk over the next 20 years. Amendment 319 by Ms. Hulland, which requests a report on borrowed military manpower. Amendment 337R1 by Mr. Descharles on the amount of reimbursements for state active duty missions deposited in the U.S. Treasury in fiscal year 2019. Amendment 344R1 by Mr. Keating on the participation of women in conflict prevention and peace building. Amendment 359 by Mr. Crow concerning the security clearance backlog. Amendment 381 by Mr. Kim regarding the testing of installations' energy resiliency systems. That completes the en bloc.
Is there any further discussion of the en bloc package? Hearing none, motion, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak quickly on my amendment directing the Secretary of Defense to provide a report on the state of unexploded ordnance on Indian reservations. Many tribal lands in the United States were formerly used as test sites for explosive weapons, greatly affecting the safety and well-being of tribes now living on these lands. These hazardous materials present both a safety risk to those living on Indian reservations and an environmental risk to the land itself. In my district, many tribes, including the Laguna, Acoma, and Zuni Pueblos, Mescalero, Apache, and Navajo Nation, are already doing the work of removing unexploded bombs from their lands with little to no help from the federal government. The cleanup and removal of unexploded ordnances left by the military is a federal responsibility. Getting this report will help the committee understand the full extent of that obligation and guide what financial resources should be provided to the tribes for ordnance removal. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
The en bloc amendment. Mr. Kemp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment here is dedicated to preparing for a threat that cannot be stopped. It's dedicated to preparing for a threat that in my district, unfortunately, we know all too well. Natural disasters in both size, scope, and frequency are on the rise, and we've seen it through flooding this year at military bases across our country. And the people in my district have seen it in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. This amendment would require the execution of 3 additional Black Start exercises on joint military installations between now and September of 2020. These exercises simulate the loss of power systems often incurred during a major natural disaster. They are a critical component of base resilience and provide a measure of security against this growing and debilitating threat. Furthermore, this amendment would encourage best practices sharing among facilities to ensure that we can learn from our successes and our mistakes. Every time we learn, we become more resilient. Every time we become more resilient, we save money and ensure our readiness. I hope you join me towards this end and support my amendment. I yield back.
Thank you. Further discussion? If not, questions on adoption of the en bloc package offered by Mr. Garamendi. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. It is now in order to consider en bloc amendment package number 4, and the chair recognizes Mr. Garamendi for the purposes of offering the en bloc amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Without objection. Well, that's your task. Let me get mine. I ask unanimous consent to call up on block package number 4, consisting of amendments been worked on by both the majority and minority, and they have agreed.
Without objection, so ordered. Will the clerk please distribute the en bloc amendment? Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to discuss the en bloc amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First Amendment, number 047 by Ms. Hill, concerning protections for unpaid interns in the federal government. Amendment 048 by Ms. Hill, concerning anti-discrimination laws within the federal government. Amendment 089 by Mr. Garamendi, regarding near-term actions to reduce reliance on foreign flagged vessels. Amendment 318R1 by Ms. Hulland, regarding a civilian and military digital engineering workforce. Amendment 421R1 by Mr. Wilson, regarding air combat maneuvering instrumentations systems. Amendment 462R2 by Ms. Gabbard, regarding the military munitions response program. Amendment 475 regarding direct hiring authorities for certain civilian employees. And Amendment 497 to change the date of a report related to the Defense Access Roads programs. And that completes the en bloc.
Is there further discussion on this en bloc package? Hearing none. So many are in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. If there are no further amendments, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the subcommittee report on readiness as amended.
Question is on the motion. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Quorum being present, the ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. And we move on. I always like to point out that I remember my first time on this committee, they handed me the little sheet there, and there were like 8 things we had to do. And I looked up and we were like 2 hours into it, and we were done with 5 of them. And I was like, cool, this is going to go quick. It's not, actually. The tougher stuff comes later, but we are off to a good start. So now we will receive the report on the Subcommittee on Military Personnel. Pursuant to Committee Rule 17 and consultation with the ranking member, we will postpone all the recorded votes on the amendments to this particular subcommittee mark until consideration of all amendments to the subcommittee mark has concluded. And the chair recognizes the chairwoman of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear, for any comments she would like to make. We're switching out the staff. If someone leaving there could start the clock before they go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Military Personnel Subcommittee mark was adopted unanimously last week, reflecting the bipartisan nature of this effort and is inclusive of many members' priorities. Ranking Member Kelly, I want to thank for his contributions to this bipartisan effort. The provisions included in this mark and military personnel provisions found in the full committee mark will continue to improve the lives of military service members and, just as importantly, their families. Items addressed by the Military Personnel Subcommittee include funding 3.1% pay raise for our service members, authorizing the department's request for end strength, authorizing credit for reservists who serve on active duty under Section 12304B to count towards the reduction eligibility age for retirement, and standardizing new mother deployment policies at 12 months postpartum. The mark includes several provisions to bolster the department's spousal employment promotions program, increases the reimbursement amount for state licensure and certifications to $1,000, and increases access to quality and affordable childcare. These small authorities do make a difference for our service members and their families. My visit to military installations across the country showed that our service member families also make sacrifices for our nation, and we commit to providing the care that our military families need and deserve, because together they serve. The mark also continues the committee's efforts to provide support for victims of sexual assault by designating Special Victims Counsel paralegals to assist SVCs in caring for their clients, and also expands the SVC program to cover eligible domestic violence victims. The mark authorizes expedited transfers to another military academy for cadet and midshipman survivors of sexual assault, and requires regulations for implementation of a safe-to-report policy at military service academies, which allows sexual assault victims to report sexual assault without fear of discipline or minor collateral misconduct. Our commitment to take care of service members and their families includes ensuring quality health care. To that end, the subcommittee mark includes several provisions addressing the quality of care in military treatment facilities, the continued reform of the military health system, and mitigating health hazards such as lead and mold in military housing. The full committee mark includes a provision to ensure service members have access to prevention and pregnancy services without having to worry about affording a copay when visiting a civilian network provider. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I believe this mark responsibly funds the Department of Defense for fiscal year 2020. The $733 billion is what many of my colleagues in the minority publicly requested in December. This mark funds the end strength the services requested and can responsibly execute without leaving billions of dollars on the table to be reprogrammed for non-defense items instead of addressing critical readiness issues. Once again, Mr. Chairman, the staff has worked in a bipartisan manner to develop the mark. I want to acknowledge the staff's efforts. Craig Green, Dave Cacchetti, Glenn Deal, Jamie Jackson, Dan Sennett, Danielle Stites, as well as my personal office staff, Mitch Hotberg, Benjamin Broadmeadow, and Heather Molason, who always worked in a collaborative and professional manner. And with that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first of all echo Chairwoman Spears' comments about the hard work and bipartisanship shown by the staff. You guys were exceptional, each and every one of you on the staff, professional staff here. The Military Personnel Subcommittee mark was adopted unanimously last week, reflecting the support and participation by all members of the subcommittee. The provisions adopted by the subcommittee build on the important reforms established in the last Congress and provide our warfighters, military families, and retirees necessary benefits and support that they have earned. To highlight just a few items, the subcommittee recommends increases in end strength for the Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, and an extension of special pay and bonuses for service members in high-demand fields. Additionally, it would require the Department of Defense to establish a common comprehensive service record for reserve component service members that will serve as definitive proof of service. The mark would also continue the committee's considerable work over the past several years aimed at improving spouse employment and child care access. The mark would increase the authorized reimbursement for spouse licensure from $500 to $1,000 and would require the department to analyze whether the license reimbursement rates are sufficient. It would also expand eligibility for the spouse tuition assistance through the My Career Advancement Program. The mark addresses the persistent issue of military child care access by requiring the department to conduct a comprehensive review of the adequacy of on-post child care, including the wait list at all military installations and whether additional financial assistance for child care is required. It would also allow surviving spouses of fallen service members to receive a stipend for child care expenses. Finally, the proposed mark would continue to build on critical reforms from the last Congress, including refining sexual assault prevention and response programs, providing enhanced oversight of military health system reforms, and improving service members' access to behavioral health. Despite the solid bipartisan work that went into the subcommittee mark, I'm very concerned that these important provisions will be undercut by a proposed $1.23 billion cut in military personnel funding. This is a cut to the account that pays for service members' pay, subsistence, bonuses, and retirement. I hope that we at some point during the markup have a debate on why these cuts have been proposed. In the meantime, I want to thank Chairwoman Spear and my colleagues on the subcommittee for their considerable work on this mark, and I yield back.
Thank you. And just to be clear, members' pay is not being cut. It's being increased by 3.1%. Is there any further discussion on the mark? Hearing none, we'll now consider en bloc package number 1, and the chair recognizes Ms. Spear for the purpose of offering the en bloc amendment.
En bloc package 1 is comprised of the following amendment.
I'm sorry, actually, there's one step we have to go on that.
Oh.
This is where you have to ask unanimous consent to call it up. Sorry, they don't have the proper paper in front of you there.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 1, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. Will the clerk please distribute the en bloc amendment? Without objection, the amendments are considered as read. The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes for the purposes of discussing or explaining the en bloc amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. En bloc 1 is comprised of the following. Amendment 060 by Ms. Davis that directs a report on Army active component support of the reserve component. Amendment 092 by Ms. Doris Small that would direct the SecDef to provide a report on providing maternity leave to the National Guard and Reserve components. Amendment number 101 by Mr. Brown that provides a casualty assistance officer to the family of ROTC graduates that have not yet reported to their first duty station in the event of their death. Amendment 011 by Mr. Turner directs the DAC iPad to submit a report on the feasibility of appointing a guardian ad litem to represent minor victims of alleged sex-related offenses in the military courts martial process. Amendment 033 by myself that creates public database with service general and flag officers, including biographical information. Amendment number 014 by Mr. Turner that requires a special victims counsel be made available to victims not later than 48 hours after a request for such. Amendment number 017 by Mr. Turner that increases the number of digital forensic examiners in military criminal investigation organizations. Amendment number 042 by myself that establishes a panel tasked with reviewing the ability of the Board of Corrections of Military Records and discharge review boards to promptly process cases. Amendment number 103 by Mr. Brown that directs the SecDef to include questions about supremacist activities, extremist activities, and racism in command climate surveys, workplace and equal opportunity survey, and workplace and gender relations survey. Amendment number 161 by Mr. Cook that limits funds from being used to consolidate the defense media activity until a period of 180 days from enactment of this act. Amendment number 168 by Mr. Desjardins that requires the department to submit report reviewing its policies permitting military personnel to use education benefits for non-traditional cyber-related educational programs. Amendment number 169 by Mr. Desjardins that requires the Chief of the National Guard Bureau to provide a report on the National Guard's role in space activities.
There further discussion on the en bloc package?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Weinberg.
Mr. Chairman, I want to just appreciate the work of this subcommittee, and I certainly support the en bloc package. I take time just to make absolutely clear that what Mr. Kelly said a few moments ago is absolutely accurate. The underlying, the personnel accounts in the chairman's mark are $1.2 billion less than the administration requested. We can talk about whether it's justified or not, that's fine, but it is a lower amount. And that is one of the accounts that I seek to restore later today. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garamendi.
As I recall, a couple of months ago, the President and the Secretary of Defense transferred $1 billion or so out of the Army personnel account to transfer to some sort of security. I think it was a wall on the border. Are we talking about the same $1 billion here?
Gentleman yields back. And that is part of our argument and part of my point about how, I mean, look, as the chairman alluded to, when we cut the Pentagon by 20% overnight without warning, that had a devastating impact. There's no question about that. We're not talking about cutting them 20%. We're talking about increasing them 2.5%. And they're talking about increasing, I don't know, 3.5%, 3%, something like that, a little bit more. So there's a difference here. And it is concerning that the Pentagon was able to find $3.6 billion, including $1 billion out of the personnel account after we had authorized it to go to personnel for some other purpose. And it's just money at the Pentagon, it's not a zero-sum game. Efficiency matters and how they spend it does matter. And I think that's a valid point. And the president took $1 billion out of personnel and nobody seemed to mind. So we need to be careful about the specifics on that. Further discussion on the en bloc package. Hearing none, all those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it. The en bloc package is accepted, and it is now in order to consider en bloc package number 2, and the chair recognizes Ms. Spear for the purposes of offering the en bloc package.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to call up en bloc package number 2, consisting of amendments that have been worked and approved with the minority.
Without objection, so ordered. Will the clerk please distribute the en bloc amendment? Without objection, the amendments are considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The en bloc package number 2 is comprised of the following. Amendment number 061 by Ms. Davis that directs a report on expanding TRICARE benefits to include coverage to allow for medical treatment for sexual dysfunction related to sexual assault or harassment. Amendment number 062 by Ms. Davis that would direct a report on access to health care services for Reserve and National Guard who disclose sexual assault. Amendment number 106 by Mr. Brown that provides a death gratuity to the family of ROTC cadets in the event of death between the time they have taken the oath but have not reported to their first duty station. Amendment number 107R1 by Mr. Brown directs DOD to make the DD 214 computable.
Traffic heading into the gas station, so making the left in the gas station, colliding with a car that police said had the green that was driving east on Northeast 8th Street.
Regiment at each recruit depot who are capable of determining whether a recruit requires